What's going on, everybody? Patrick on here, and welcome to the Knuckles and Gloves podcast. I'm here with my dude Aris Pina, who is, of course, just like me, a boxing history maniac. So we're here to talk about boxing history. Aris, what's up, dude?
Everything's going really good, my friend. How are you?
Pretty good, man. I think that just like you were inspired by kind of semi-current events and stuff like that. That's how a lot of the time we come up with topics and history stuff for the show. And I mean, I think probably the most recent example of what we're going to be talking about today, and that is this kind of, I don't know if you would really even call it a rivalry, but I guess a rivalry between Mexico and the UK when it comes to boxing, and probably what inspired this, I think, in the last few weeks. And now there's also been some new developments about this, of course, has been Galalia Fai's loss to Francisco Rodriguez Jr. I think that was kind of what kicked this into gear. And then in the last few UK boxing shows that we've watched, there's been a couple pretty close calls with a few British stars who were either undefeated or on the way up or whatever. So, like I said, inspired by current events, we're really just talking about that, like I said, rivalry.
Yeah, and it should be noted too that it just came out in the past day or two that Yafai's opponent, what'd you say it was Rodriguez?
Yeah, Francisco
Um,
Rodriguez
yeah,
Jr.
Francisco Rodriguez just had adverse findings in his testing. Did you hear about that?
I did, yeah, and I made a somewhat flippant comment about it on Twitter, just because I personally find it funny. And apart from this podcast subject about the UK and Mexico, and even aside from that fight, I don't care about Rodriguez or Yafai in that regard. Just that we're more than 10 years on and still relying on Vada and Victor Conti and all this type of bullshit for the discussion of PEDs and boxing moving forward, which is just it. I have to roll my eyes so fucking hard I do a backflip. It makes me
Mhm.
hurt inside. So, like I said, though, that I'm not trying to say that it's not the case or no, he's clean. I don't really give a shit. More than anything, it's just important to the discussion that we're having in terms of, if we're saying that that's what it's inspired by, then it's
Oh, of
only
course.
it's only fair
No,
to
no, I
mention.
just yeah, I was just had to mention that like it's and also too, he's another Reynoso fighter, isn't he? And that's why I was like kind of bringing it up as like the seventh fighter now who's been kind of popped for something funky. And it's like at one point, not to veer off of what we're going to be eventually talking about, but worthy to bring up at one point, when are we going to start questioning this? Because like this is a major problem. What other prominent trainer can you think of in the past now? No, I'm not talking about a guy like Conti who, has his own company that supplies supplements. We're talking about actual trainer in their entire camp who's had this many guys pop for something. And past, I don't even know. I can't even go back to think about something like that. You know what I mean?
No, 100%, dude, and especially on a personal level, if I'm going to be talking shit about Victor Conti and that kind of shit, dude, I gotta keep it fair and
Oh,
say when there's an obvious correlation here when there are a number of different fighters who either work when they were popped or recently did when they popped positive. Yeah, man, that's not a good look for that entire gym. For that entire gym, it's not a good look whatsoever. And I mean, like I said, it really the entire discussion around PEDs and boxing, I don't want to shut it down by saying it's complicated. Bye bye.
yeah.
But it is complicated, at least as far as I'm concerned. And so it's really tough to kind of navigate that with shit when we don't really have any mechanism in play to, the states are all splintered still. The ABC and stuff like that is still kind of a toothless organization that can't really do shit. Who knows what the Muhammad Ali Act is going to be looking like in the next few years, the way the fucking government's wheels have been spinning. So like I said, I don't want to shut it down. I also just don't want to bog this fucking episode down with PED discussion. But yeah, dude, that's not a good look. It's not a good look whatsoever. And of course, we still, I guess, have to wait for like B samples and further testing and shit like that. So for all we know, it might just be an anomaly. I have no idea, but certainly doesn't look good.
Mhm. 1,000%. And it's just one of those, it's crazy too, because he's such a high profile trainer with a guy that's had such a vast stable of champions. And then you see, like, you go through the roster, including his top guy, Canelo, of everyone having, being popped for X, Y, and Z, even if it's like the smallest little amounts or whatever it may be, people go way into detail more than I do about it because, like, I'll be completely honest. I don't, know enough about it to really like go into the crazy semantics of everything of how much they're actually getting popped for and everything. I'm just going under the assumption you get popped, you get popped. It is what it is. Like, I don't care if it's like a micro bit or if you're going crazy like what was it, Big Baby Miller there over there who got like was like juicing like an 80s wrestler. And so
Yeah, you all he's getting caught like multiple times with
yeah,
like, fucking
crazy amounts of stuff. You know what I mean? The type that like was happening in a WWF locker room when they were taking
yeah,
him, shoving him
shit
into each
fools were
other's
injecting
sockets.
into
So
their
yeah,
ass cheek in
exactly.
1986, like what are you doing, buddy? Yeah, no, for real though. And even without knowing much of the chemistry involved and all that, all pharmacology and all that type of stuff, even if you don't know any of that or aren't, aware of any of that kind of stuff going on, it's still just it doesn't make sense. The odds that that would be the case accidentally or something like that, or that they're all just whoa, there's some crazy beef going on in this area. Come on, dude, get the fuck out of here. That doesn't make much sense at all. They went through an entire like argument of when Canelo popped, it was turned into a big stupid discussion. Anyway, so yeah, it doesn't look good, but still nonetheless, just assuming for a moment that Rodriguez was clean and we're looking simply at the result of the fight as it is right now and simply as kind of the results of this Mexico UK matchup that we keep seeing over the last several decades that we'll get into. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting trend. Needless to say, although there are going to be some anomalies here and there, of course, that we'll mention. But like I said, what are we getting into here, dude?
Yeah, it is a rivalry that I guess doesn't really get discussed as much as the famed Mexico Puerto Rico one that gets brought up every
Of
time there's
course,
like a fight, involving someone like that, and then you get brought up like, oh, Salvador Sanchez, Wilfredo Gomez, and Chavez, and so and so, and yabba 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 yabba. But like this has been a sword rivalry that's gone on for, like you said, many decades, and there have been high profile fights and like major ones that have like shifted the course of history in its own way that have taken place within it. And yeah, it's one of those that's a really interesting one when you decide to do a deep dive on it because sometimes you look back and you forget that some of these fights that took place, some of these fights that actually took place, or like the rivalries that took place because that happened so long ago now that some of them from like the 60s or even so on, where how many unless you're a hardcore nerd and you really want to look back on that type of like lineage, you don't think about it as much. But that being said, there's been there's been some big ones, and you said there would be some anomalies. So I'm going to start with an anomaly because we're going to go back now to the very end of 1975. So the 70s were an interesting time, one of the most pivotal times in boxing history when it came to when it comes down to it of in decades. And it's interesting too because I was reading a Ring magazine from March of 1980. So if you go in the timeline of that March of 1980, that means it was like the end of the 70s when that came out, right? Because that's how it usually is. Like the March issue of the next
usually,
year will
yeah,
usually
usually it
like
was like 3 or 4 months behind.
yeah. So because I always as a kid I always used to confuse the shit out of me too. I'm like, why are we saying March of whatever year it was, 1996, but I'm still here in November of 90, 95. Anyways, um, I was reading the magazine and they were actually speculating on where the 70s would land in the annals of history and the entire decade and the scope of it and what went down. And they were going by like, each year and stuff like that. And it's interesting in the sense that there was almost like there is clearly two halves where some of the guys actually lasted the entire decade. Muhammad Ali, for example, lasted the entire decade. Was he the same by 1978? As he was in 1970 when he made his exile return against Jerry Corey? Clearly not. He was an absolute shell and probably should have retired by the end of 79. But he still lasted. Roberto Duran, who was almost there for the entire decade, for example. I mean, he was as a pro, but I mean, as like, a high profile champion. He becomes champion 72, relinquishes the belt around, what was it, 79, and then, moves up after that. And, but there were others. So, all-time great champions who didn't last the entire decade for one reason or another. Carlos Monzon, who started the decade beating Nino Benvenuti, and then by the time 76 happened, he was retired. And now the guy I'm bringing up right now, Jose Napoles, and the guy he lost it to, John H. Stracey. So, you go back to that time, Jose Napoles or Napoles, it's Napoles, right?
Yeah,
Um,
Napoles, yeah.
yeah, is Mantequilla, aka Butter, and one of those guys that exemplified his nickname. I mean, just one of the most smoothest tacticians you can ever watch. I love watching Napoles footage. I mean, everything he did was so compact and beautiful, and combinations, and he would just knock the shit out of you too. It wasn't just like he was pitter pat puncher. It was a beautiful practitioner that exemplified everything that was good in the sport. A guy that was originally from Cuba, but then when Castro took over and basically banned boxing and sports in general over there with his takeover, and Napoles, who is based obviously, being in his home country, knew he had to get out there in exile. And one of the places he ended up in Mexico, and that's where he made his home base. And he was taken in immediately, right, Pat?
I mean, I
Well,
don't know the process, but he was definitely accepted for
that's
sure,
what I
at
mean.
least
I
eventually.
mean by the public, yeah, like just and there's the fans and everything.
Yeah, before too long, actually, it was funny. I wrote about this like a couple of years ago, but when I was reading through some Mexican newspapers, I noticed that so similarly to I swear to God, this won't be too long of a little side job here that I'm talking. But I noticed that just like in the U.S. newspapers, historically, like there's the Associated Press, United Press, there used to be the INS, the International News Service. That's not really in use anymore. And in any case, similarly, a lot of other countries have like their version of like the AP or whatever. And Mexico, especially during this time, did too. And when I was looking through Mexican newspapers, I noticed that it seemed to be sort of kind of like a standard for a number of those news services at the time when they were when they were mentioning Napoles early on, that they started calling him El Cubano Mexicano, so the like the Mexican Cuban or the Cuban Mexican, however you want to say, and basically kind of acknowledging right away that like this dude is like a refugee here, but like we're taking him in. He's Mexican, like he's one of us. And that what was especially interesting, especially from the perspective of people now, where they won't shut the fuck up about Mexican style and commentators and stuff like that now, where pretending like there's Mexican fighters have only ever been brawlers or something like that, like a bunch of idiots. But that is obviously not the case, and especially not with Napoles, who was far more of a boxer puncher with emphasis on the boxer. He was a pretty good puncher, but he was more of like a stylist, more of a smooth operator type of guy. And I mean, despite that, it goes against the logic that people kind of want to apply now, but he was definitely embraced as, he's one of us, dude. He's a Mexican.
I mean, totally. Yeah. I mean, so like his first 20 or so fights were in Cuba before we said the takeover, and he turned pro in 1959. He moved over to Mexico in 1961. Excuse me. And even though he only lost one fight when I was in Cuba, like he really took off when he made his home base in Mexico. That's when the competition really took off. And like, you look at some of the names if you want to bring up box rec, there's well, like one name, for instance, that you see over and over. There was a guy by the name of LC Morgan. And LC Morgan was one of those guys that was a journeyman, but one of those tough as nails journeymen, especially from back in the day, where a journeyman took on a different term in the 60s and 70s and 50s, where even if they didn't have the best record, there was a really good chance he was going to knock your ass out or something, or you can spring an upset just because he was a very well-rounded fighter. A lot of those losses could have gone other ways, just tough bumps in the road. You know what I mean? Just an overall good-ass pro. Even if it's a spotty record, it's a good-ass pro. And he fought him 4 times and actually lost to him once on cuts. And that's another thing that's interesting about his nickname, like Mantequilla, is because, when we said smooth as butter, he also cut as easy as butter. and that would become a detriment throughout his career. Even though he was such a smooth operator and would easily outclass guys and knock them cold and do everything like that, he also had to contend with having cuts being dealt with him all the time, which he was usually able to get through it, but sometimes, to his detriment, fights could be stopped and against him for that.
Yeah, that was one of the issues is he had a bit of scar tissue around his eyebrows. And so, I mean, that's just kind of one of the hallmarks of a fighter is one of kind of the stereotypical, cauliflower ears, flattened nose, fucked up eyebrows, stuff like that. And so, that was exactly how he wound up, getting into trouble a handful of different times.
Totally. And then other guys on his record, for instance, he went to Venezuela to fight Carlos Hernandez, who was the junior welterweight champion, the guy that beat Eddie Perkins. Um, Tough as nails dude too. Another guy who was known as a monster puncher, and someone who's never really talked about today because he's just kind of known as a footnote in history. But
Yeah,
still,
Famoso
really,
Hernandez. Yeah.
but a very, very good win. And there's actually, I'm thinking of a photo. The first time I remembered reading about Hernandez was because I want to say it was in one of those ring magazines. They were doing like, you remember in the 90s, they would do like the photo quizzes and they would just come up with a theme and then they would show different guys. And there was like a photo of Hernandez and he was a good looking guy and he had he's like having a smirk and I think he has like two lady attractive women on his arm or stuff like that. And he's kind of,
Hmm.
hobnobbing. But anyways, that was a big win. And then in 1965, he beats Eddie Perkins, the guy that Hernandez actually beat for the junior welterweight crown. And Perkins is on the back end at this point. Don't get me wrong, but still, Perkins was one of those guys that he had been around forever, and he still have some good quality wins coming up after this. I mean, he fought well into the 70s, and one of the definition, along with Joe Brown, the lightweight champion, as a world traveler. Like this guy defended his title all over the world, wherever he could, because he wasn't really popular in America. He didn't have the best, most crowd pleasing style, but he traveled wherever he had to go, usually in the other guy's hometown, and would come out with a defining victory. So that's another really good win. Adolf Pruitt, excuse me, was another contender. And then by the time he fights Curtis Coates for the welterweight championship in 1969, I mean he's been boxing for a decade, and yeah, he was as good as ready at that point. So when he beats Coates, who was another really credible champion, and I would spend more time on him here, but we're talking more about Napoles over here. Coates was one of those guys that he had beat Luis Rodriguez, another great Cuban, had a number of great wins under his resume, and just a really, really good overall boxer puncher who had underrated power himself, like a really good champion. And for Napoles, the way he broke him down and stopped him and bloodied him, beat him up, and thoroughly stopped him, it was like a really just thorough beatdown. Was extremely impressive. Does it in the rematch, and then he was just on his way. And from there, as I was getting there earlier, he becomes one of the most, one of the more dominant champions of or superstars for that matter of the early 70s, along the lines of, he's in the same realm as Carlos Monzon, even though he would eventually try to challenge him and unsuccessfully, and Muhammad Ali. But it was around, I say those were the three guys right there. Duran would eventually join them.
Yeah, there's no question, especially in the late 60s. A lot of people have to,
Bob Foster too, excuse me.
well, and a lot of people have to kind of sometimes be reminded that a lot of the boxing slash non-boxing news when it came to boxing figures was still on Muhammad Ali because he had been exiled and his, fight back toward getting his license back and stuff like that. That was regularly covered in the news. It was still a really popular news item. But in the meanwhile, Joe Frazier was still fighting on, and the heavyweight division was still at least somewhat interesting enough that it was still covered. But when that happens and there's weirdness at heavyweight, sometimes they still, reach down farther and wait for other stars and shit like that. And the more dominant fighters, while they didn't have an official pound for pound list at that time, they still thought in those terms. They still were like, okay, who are the lower weight fighters who are dominant in the sport or popular or that fans are reacting to? And there was no question that in Mexico and in Southern California, Jose Napoles was one of those fighters kind of filling in the gap, especially because in the mid to late 60s, Southern California was starting to really come up in the game when it came to Mexican fighters, especially, but also other fighters, of course, of other ethnicities. But Napoles had gained a little bit of a foothold in this area, and so there's absolutely no question with along with a number of other fighters in other weight classes, Napoles was one of the clearly one of the most talented, but also one of the most popular.
Yeah. And I mean, he was in a deep, deep welterweight division too. The early 70s welterweight division was teeming with a bunch of fucking tough as nails guys who were all ready and chomping at the bit to become champion. And in any other era where Napoles wasn't reigning, they probably would have been champion. Guys like Ernie the Red Lopez, Danny Little Red Lopez's big brother. And he's obviously not remembered like Danny Lopez, but he was a tough as nails contender back in the day who held wins over guys like Hedgeman Lewis and everyone else around there. I mean, just a bad motherfucker. But
Yeah, just unfortunate timing kind of for when
yeah,
he came around, one of those guys who probably
absolutely.
would have been definitely one of those guys who probably would have been champion in another
Oh,
era.
especially like in the splintered belt era right now. I mean, are you kidding me? Shit. By far. And a guy who had made multiple defenses. But that being said, yeah, unfortunately he had to run into a guy like Napoles, and that's when you would see like the photos, the famous photos of him being knocked unconscious and Napoles standing over him, asking him, get up, brother, please, like, I hope I didn't hurt you or something like that, because he would give up a gallant effort, but he would end up losing. Another one, for instance, Hedgeman Lewis, who absolutely would be a champion in any other era. Um, trained by Eddie Futch, consummate boxer. I mean, just an absolute pro. Everything he did was just well rounded. One of those guys that, as Eddie Futch used to say, the type of pro that you just watch shadow box as opposed to watching some other guys fight. That's how good Hedgeman Lewis was. And I remember asking recently when I saw um, Harold Weston, who lives in my neighborhood, the old welterweight contender from the 70s. And I asked him about his fight with Hedgeman Lewis because I was like, you mentioned in the Ring Magazine article about the best you faced, and you said that Lewis was the overall best guy you faced. You faced Hearns and you faced Benitez and yada yada yada. But I was like, just curious what came with him, and he's same thing. He was like, Hedgeman Lewis was just the best professional I ever fought. He was like, everything was just so good. He was like, I was on my toes the whole time. The fact that I fought him to a draw was almost an accomplishment to me. So like the fact that again, Napoles had that a guy like Hedgeman Lewis's number, and Gene Jocelyn. It goes on, and the only time he had a hiccup, and again, it goes back to his cuts, is when he fought of all people though Billy Backus. And again, nothing against Billy Backus. All right, he was a really tough guy, especially back as a pro. A guy that like he wasn't. I wouldn't even call him one of the better contenders of that time because guys like Ernie Lopez and Hedgeman Lewis, who did beat him a couple of times, and even Clyde Gray, I would rate above Billy Backus. But that being said, he was a very tough guy. Carmen Basilio's nephew, and he had a following over in the Syracuse area. And in their first fight, Napoles went to Syracuse to fight him, and suffered a gnarly cut, which only got exasperated. I think that was the one time that Dundee wasn't in his corner. Somebody wasn't in the corner that night to really help it out, and it got really messed up. And Backus ended up scoring a major upset. So Napoles lost the belt in there, but in the rematch, which that's what it is. He brought Dundee in the rematch, Angelo Dundee in as a cut man for him in the rematch. Knowing he was probably going to get cut again, and which I think he actually did, but since he had capable hands this time, it was under control, and he beat daylights out of Backus to regain the belt. But other than that, his only hiccup was when he tried to challenge Carlos Monzon, the middleweight champion in 1974, and it's like that was just gonna be a crazy challenge in itself. Would that have been a major event today? In any era, it would have been because it's two all-time greats fighting each other. You can't, and kudos to him moving up like that. I mean, like people might try to compare it to like what Crawford was doing, but it's not the same thing because Monzon is a lot bigger than what Canelo has ever been, what Crawford would ever be, or what Napoles would ever be. It was like he was a big middleweight, just tall and lanky, and Napoles was a good size welterweight, but he wasn't a good size. He was a small guy. He wasn't a middleweight. You know what I mean? He just didn't have that type of size. And a guy like Monzon, once he was able to like navigate that reach and just really get in there, he just busted him up and stopped him. But I mean, no big deal on that end. You know what I mean? It was just like two greats, but one guy was just obviously bigger. But by the time he fought Stracey in 75, I'm sorry, it took a little bit of a while to get there. You can kind of see that the wheels were falling off a little bit. Armando Muniz, who was another longtime contender and a guy who probably would have been champion in other eras, gave him really two extremely tough goes before eventually succumbing to him. And then he fought Johnny Stracey at this point. And I'll let you get into Stracey.
Yeah, actually, Stracey, if I'm not, I'd have to look double check, but I'm without looking double checking, I'm pretty sure he was the European welterweight champion. And I mean, at the very least, I'm fairly positive he was the British welterweight champion. But in any case, he was not a bad fighter whatsoever. He was actually a pretty good fighter. But you could, like you said, I think that a big part of it was that, you know, Napoles had been fighting nearly 20 years. And on top of that, he was not the kind of fighter that was like, he was not super disciplined when it came to getting away from the ring, and he was kind of known for that. Apparently he was supposedly a womanizer, but liked them somewhat young. How much so, I don't know, and not getting into that. But point being, he was definitely somewhat mischievous and got into shit and, apparently liked to party away from the ring. And so, needless to say, my point is that historically has always shortened the ring career of a fighter to some degree, even if it didn't, they still wound up having a successful or great or all-time great career, whatever it was. Had they not done that, it maybe would have been even better. So that being said, I think that a lot of that was, like you said, the wheels were starting to come off. Armando Muniz was definitely a very good fighter, but the kind of fighter, and especially stylistically, I think the kind of fighter that Napoles probably would have handled a little bit easier a few years before. And so that set him up, for this Stracey loss. And I think a lot of it was just that, Napoles, if you look like it photos of when he was a little bit older, he still has really bad cuts like through his eyebrows, like, those breaks in the eyebrows that fighters get. You can definitely see those. And so it was just that, like, after nearly 90 fights or whatever it was, dude, the guy's face is not holding up.
Totally. And, Stracey was one of those guys that sometimes you have fighters that come along a little bit later on. And I mean, Stracey did turn pro in like the late 60s, but he clearly wasn't, he was going through the UK system. He wasn't a guy that was like fighting every like world-class welterweight back then because he clearly wasn't ready for that. You know what I mean? But like the the fighters that he did fight clearly got him ready for that. And as he moved up, and what I mean by like he got a chance to catch up with some of the guys from the early 70s. Like he finished the career of the aforementioned Ernie Lopez. Lopez by this time was completely like finished. He had lost to Armando Muniz. He had just lost again recently to Napoles in another title fight. And a guy with his style, he was completely spent. And so when he went to the UK in '74, Stracey cut him up and just stopped him. And after a few more wins, that's what he said. He fights Napoles in Mexico. And of course, Stracey comes in there as the underdog, even though like Napoles, like we said, is old. Like Stracey is still kind of an unknown and a guy that should be like with his credentials, even though he beat Lopez, a guy that Napoles should still be able to like, beat before someone else beats him next year or so. But that doesn't become the case. In round one, it looks like it might be the case because Napoles dropped him and beat him up a little bit. But soon after that, Stracey came on and just one thing about Stracey, I'll give him that is that like he did start a little bit slow in fights and like you could outbox him and he wasn't the hardest guy to hit. But once he started getting going, he knew how to fight. Like, he had good power in his punches and he knew how to put combinations together. And he was a durable ass guy who kept on chugging. And it was just too much for Napoles at that point. Napoles' eyes started getting really puffy and cut up and he was getting beat up and eventually he got stopped. And it was a big upset. I mean, I think it was the upset of the year, in fact. And but that was that, and that added, to the UK Mexico rivalry, a big win for the UK, maybe their biggest one because Napoles was a legit all-time great. But Stracey didn't wasn't just a cheese champion either. To his credit, like he beat Hedgeman Lewis, another guy that was from the early '70s, and we said could have been champion in the other era. And he started slow in that fight, but eventually came through and battered Lewis and had him like reeling, and when he stopped him, and there's the other one too. I guess you can add this in with Carlos Palomino when he lost the championship. Stracey was brave as shit in that fight. That was a really good fight, and it's good. It's a fun fight to go back and watch because early on, Stracey was going toe to toe with Palomino and basically being head up and even with him in terms of like what was being landed and all that. But Palomino also was a ridiculous body puncher and then started absolutely railing Stracey's body like insanely. And eventually Stracey starts wilting from that because those body punches fucking hurt. You know what I mean? There's only so much of those you can take. I don't care how good a shape you're in. And by the end of the fight, Stracey looks like he's about to like throw up his insides, like he is gone.
Yeah, dude. And just briefly to kind of piggyback off what you're saying with Stracey Napoles, it was a huge crowd. It was like 60 or 70,000 there live. And it was also broadcast to the UK on BBC. So it was a huge, audience in the UK who's, of course, rooting on Stracey. And of course, from their perspective, it's a hostile crowd and, he's away from home and stuff. But nonetheless, that still does count. Those things do count in the fight and whatnot. And being able to pull that off was fucking massive. But, like you said, it wasn't like he just immediately got knocked off. He made the defense, but then it kind of the script gets flipped a little bit because Stracey's promoter, Mickey Duff, who is of course a legendary UK promoter, especially around like the 70s and 80s. The 70s and early 80s were like, his, I don't know, yeah, probably his heyday going into the 90s too, perhaps.
Totally.
But anyway, Mickey Duff supposedly thought that Palomino was going to be an easy defense for Stracey, that it was just, the wrong style, that he was going to eat him up, he's going to pick him apart and stuff like that. And that Palomino was just a little bit too much of like a brawler, wasn't skilled enough and stuff like that. And needless to say, that was a massive miscalculation, dude. Um, Long story short, yeah, it was like you said, there was a lot of kind of like early back and forth between them, but it basically wound up with Palomino overwhelming Stracey, who just looked exhausted. Not too unlike. I mean, he didn't wind up actually doing it, but not too unlike Robbie Peden against Marco Antonio Barrera with the puking and shit.
Yeah.
He just
Yeah.
looked like in bad shape, like he was like, oh no. But then he wound up getting knocked down twice, and then after the second knockdown, he was brave as fuck and got back up, but the ref was just like, dude, no, no. And there's a famous photo of him after the fight when Palomino's got his belt on and kind of saluting, and Stracey's just covering his face, like weeping. It's like, oh no, you got to feel bad for the guy, but that he was on both ends of this Mexico versus UK rivalry.
Yeah. And I mean, it probably ended best that it was a guy like Palomino to beat him up because much like think of the welterweight division that was coming in the late 70s and was coming up there. And there was some absolute monsters that were coming on the scene at that point that just would have, Stracey retired soon after. He lost to Davey Boy Green that had one more fight and then retired after that. But it's like, had he hung around and still being a name, I mean, like, imagine what guys like Cuevas or Duran or even Leonard or, Sorrel Hearns for that matter, any of those guys want to potentially could have done to him. Benitez, you know what I mean? Like it wouldn't have been pretty, but it was just thinking about it. That's still like one of the biggest ones out of their rivalry and one that should have been brought up. So, and
Yeah,
Stracey's a
dude.
great guy. I mean, I to leave it at that. Stracey's a good dude. He made it to the Hall of Fame last year for the first time, I believe, in many years. But he used to be a mainstay there back in like the mid 2000s every year with his wife, who was like 2 feet taller than him, and because Tracy's not a big dude. Like you see him and you think of him, I'm
I've
like,
heard
wow.
stories.
But he's a cool dude though. Like he just likes to sing too, kind of like one of those guys. He just always likes to be the life of the party and just the overall really fun guy to be around. So
He had some absolutely fucking killer mutton chops too back in the day, bro. It was during the heyday of the motherfucking mutton chop sideburns, and that
yeah,
fool was rocking them.
1,000%.
I mean, I guess the heyday since like 1867, but whatever. They
When a
kind of
guy that was a guy nicknamed the Butcher, who was a literal butcher at like Joe's Chop Shop or something like that. It was,
I mean, I guess you're legally obliged to fucking wear mutton chops if you fucking yeah. You know, that was a good twofer though, for sure, because it gets a nice chunk of history Like I think that like it was obviously before our time in terms of actually being able to see it live and whatnot, but there are some people just old enough that they'll remember that shit. However, I'm gonna go a little bit more recent. I'm gonna kind of it's not cheating, it's just kind of picking the easy fruit here. I don't really give a fuck, but it's a fun fight to talk about for people of about our age and a little bit older because we remember it, we got to watch it live, etc. And also there's there's some measure of satisfaction to it, regardless of however you fucking fell. And you probably already know what I'm about to say, but that's Marco Antonio Barrera versus Nassim Hamed, dude. You know, I was never a Hamed fan. I didn't hate him. Like I wasn't just like, oh, I can't wait to see. I fucking want to see him hurt. I wasn't like that, but it was just that he just did seem like a dick. He seemed like an asshole. He seemed like somebody who did deserve to get his ass kicked at some point. But it was also clear I wasn't ignorant to the fact that he was obviously a very good fighter, that he was obviously very talented. But he was a dick, though. He was kind of a dick. He kind of deserved it.
I yeah, I was a Hamed fan as a kid. We've discussed this before. I didn't hate Hamed. And the reason why I didn't hate Hamed is because he was knocking fools out. Like, did I want to see him lose? Did I want to see him lose? Yeah, I mean, like the first time I saw him was when he fought Daniel Alicea on the Showtime card. And when he got clipped on that, I was like, oh, I think everybody thought that because that was the first time he got hit. I mean, like he wasn't like hurt, but still, like seeing that herky jerky style in a guy like Alicea who clearly he wasn't equipped to handle a guy like Hamed, but at the same time, he wasn't scared of him either, as you noticed. You know what I mean? And like he was throwing, as a compact puncher, and then like he caught him right there. Remember Hamed tried coming in with some stupid uppercut and boom, bink, and he went down. And I was like, oh shit. And then when he fought Kevin Kelly, same thing. It was like, oh, the Kelly thing, he got dropped a few times and they go back and forth. So like I didn't hate Hamed. I liked him too because of his theatrics. Like he said what he was gonna do. He was knocking guys out, but I mean, like I liked it. Like I liked his entrances, and all that. It was when he started getting boring and stupid where I was just like, all right, enough is enough with this. Where it started with Wayne McCullough, where okay, I get it. Like you can't knock everybody out. McCullough was like a guy like you could take a sledgehammer to his head and he's just gonna keep on coming at you. Like that wasn't, couldn't hurt the man. So no big deal. Was that the most exciting fight? But no, I gave it a pass though anyways because of who he was fighting. But when the fights with like Cesar Soto and stuff started happening, and you could tell by that time that Hamed just didn't give a shit. I'm just like, I can't with this guy anymore. Like, the jig is up. This is stupid. Like, enough is enough. And when he starts struggling with guys like Paul Weir and Augie Sanchez, especially, that's when, the excitement starts with people, especially me too, where you're like, yo, I think the wheels are coming off. Someone might be able to beat this guy eventually. Because he was just looking, worse and worse. And we find out afterwards too, because he wasn't even really training at this point. He just didn't give a shit. And
Yeah.
but at the same time, I'm not sure if the general public thought that back then, at least, that Barrera was going to be that guy because we got to think about Barrera too back then. Remember, Barrera had lost twice to Junior Jones, and people had already written him off at that to the point that when he fought Morales the first time, it was an exciting fight, but a fight that overwhelmingly everybody thought Morales was going to win and win convincingly. And then Barrera wins it, but like, no, he didn't win it. Excuse me, he loses that fight, but like he put on such a great performance then, especially because people thought he won, that everyone's just like, oh shit. But still, he took a ton of punishment in that fight too. But it was, correct me if I'm wrong, it was the Jesus Salud fight where Barrera turned boxer really like. I mean, he showed flashes of it in the second Junior Jones fight where he tried to box more, but like he really turned like compact boxer in the Salud fight. And Salud really tough as nails. Was a former junior featherweight champion from like 1990 or some shit. But I mean, a guy who had been around the block, let's say, for a long time. And I was kind of surprised that he was an HBO opponent in the early 2000s, but whatever. But I mean, Barrera beat the daylights out of him, but did it like not in his normal aggressive style. He did it like in a really like in a boxing style. You know what I mean? The one that would become his mainstay for the rest of his career, more or less. But like, I remember being wowed by that, being like, holy shit, like, look at her. Like my man was just ripping combinations like Arguello or Salvador Sanchez. Like he was looking really good. And so it became really intriguing when he fought Hamed if he was going to bring that style into it, or was he going to try to do the old rampaging style?
Well, and we did a couple years ago for anybody who's newer or whatever. We did a few years ago. We did like a tribute to like Boxing After Dark, and we've done like the best Boxing After Dark shows, stuff like that. So obviously, Barrera in the mid '90s has already been brought up by us, and we're not unfamiliar. But, at some point, it probably wouldn't hurt for us to like redo that shit or whatever. Anyway, long story short, uh, we're fairly familiar by this point with seeing Barrera on Boxing After Dark. People who had followed his career even before then had seen him at the Forum. He also had a little bit of a following in the early '90s because he fought in Southern California a whole bunch of times. And that was his style. He had an aggressive style. He was a very good body puncher. The kind of shit that he did against Eric Morales in that first fight, especially where they each just went in, put their head down, and just fucking dug, like that was partially his style, like that was part of what he did. Not mindless, of course, but just aggressive. And yeah, so he obviously seemed to get a bit of a second wind, second career, however you want to call it, by altering his style, turning more into a boxer puncher with the emphasis on boxer than a more of a brawler or an aggressive kind of combination puncher type of guy. And obviously that was probably aided by the Junior Jones fiascos too. God, he just that's it's I don't want to call it a blemish because Junior Jones was a very good fighter, but that was poison for his ass. He just could not fucking get over Junior Jones for some reason. But once he got beyond those, I wish he would have gotten a chance to fucking avenge something. But even so, that probably affected him going forward, turning a little bit more into a boxer and avoiding punishment rather than just walking headlong into those counters and shit like that. By the time he got to Hamed, though, even so, a lot of people were kind of like, yeah, he's used up. He's been fighting for a long time. He's already probably on the downslide. What can he do, etc. And they're not like necessarily wrong for thinking that. You know what I'm saying? This is one of those fights, kind of like Hopkins Trinidad, maybe Zujuda around that time, where the people are like, oh yeah, obvious. I saw that coming a mile. It's so obvious. Everybody knew. No, because look at the odds. That's exactly not, that's the opposite. Not everybody knew. Look at the fucking expert picks, etc. Not everybody knew. Some of us got it right, some of us didn't. And this was one of those fights where a lot of people were like, I don't know, man. Like, Barrera gets hit a lot and Hamed can punch. You know what I'm saying? Not a lot of people. Well, and I'll also give this a fucking caveat on the actual fight itself. The scores and round by round, it's actually a somewhat close fight, but also a lot of that is aided by the fact that Marco Antonio Barrera did a motherfucking Bam Bam Bigelow straight up fucking like heave ho into the ring post in the final round, which cost him. And also, he kind of like took some rounds off. So it's not like Hamed was winning rounds per se, but still, I'll give him that.
No, he straight up grabbed him like one of the bushwhackers would back in the day, like bushwhacker Luke or something, and just slammed him head first into the ring post. And you see poor Hamed's head just like lean back and his eyes just roll around because he's already been whooped the entire fight, and that was just the icing on the cake.
He
Like, what the
just
fuck?
dog face gremlined his ass and just was like,
Yeah.
bam. Yeah, honestly, like he's I guess somewhat lucky that Hamed didn't get like injured or there wasn't something else that happened because that shit was pretty fucking diabolical.
I mean, I have to say, honestly, I think what makes everybody go like, "Oh, you saw what he did to Hamed, he ruined him," blah, 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 is because Hamed's career was essentially over after that. Had Hamed continued his career and had success after that, I'm not sure how many people, like people would still talk about, oh, remember the time Barrera embarrassed him, but it wouldn't be to that point of like, oh, look what he did. He ruined him. He did that. He made him run off in the sport and all that. I mean, I don't know. Like Hamed had a giant ego, obviously, and for him to lose, the way he did and get thoroughly outboxed, sure, that was definitely a major blow to him. But he did try to come back in one fight, which he did win, but he didn't look that good in it either. But I mean, when you think about it too, you got to keep into account. By the time he fought Barrera, he already had 1 foot out the door. Like he really did. Like it was just
Yeah.
he wasn't really taking his career seriously at that point like that. And in fact, people say that knew him or around his circle say that he stopped taking his career seriously after he beat Steve Robinson, and that was for his first world title. And that was what, 1995, 96? And think about how much time that encompasses from that time of when he was on top until the Barrera fight. And it's like, I mean, he was fighting, there was a few guys over there too that were like pasties that just gave him spectacular knockouts, like Said Lowell, I believe his name was, who got knocked out in like 10 seconds or some shit. And then Billy Hardy, the former Orlando Canizales victim.
Yeah. There were a couple of kind of like regional level dudes that were
Yeah.
like not that were like brave, but like not very good.
The Billy Hardy one was bad because like if you see Hardy's face, like he was really pale and he kind of has like blondish red hair. And when he went down, you see his face contort into this most like grimacing manner. And it's like, damn, like his face just gets all red and he's just, it looks like someone took a bat to him, basically. Like, you know, and I
Yeah.
mean, getting hit by Hamed, I guess, kind of comparatively would feel like that. I consider him maybe the hardest punching featherweight ever, at least in the top five, definitely top three, and like monster puncher. Regardless of what you want to say about him, he was an absolute monster puncher. And Barrera did, even though Hamed um, was already, like we said, 1 foot out the door and not really taking shit seriously. Barrera had to be on his best behavior that night. He could not do the shit he did against Junior Jones. He couldn't do how he fought against Morales in their first fight, or how he did against Kennedy McKinney, or other examples, whatever, Agapito Sanchez, whatever. And it's like he had to be disciplined. He had to fight that fight that we
Yeah.
mentioned, like he did against Jesus Salud, but even more disciplined than that. You couldn't make mistakes,
I
you know.
remember just being on the edge of my seat watching that shit, dude. I
Because
remember just being
I mean,
like,
we're all just almost anticipating at some point Hamed's going to catch
yeah,
him with some
I
shit.
knew I was like, dude, he's gonna land. He's
Yeah,
gonna land. And it was just like it just never really happened. Like, I mean, not the way that you thought it was gonna. And I was just like, oh shit, like this fool's
sure.
fucking giving him the business. Like he's really giving him the business. Yeah, that was not all that fucking expected. And like I said, I started out saying I was not a big Hamed fan pretty much ever,
Mhm.
but it's still annoying every time Hamed gets brought up at all because anyway, like a history guy, blah blah blah. When I make the posts, that's always anytime Hamed's mentioned, that's always Barrera, Marco Antonio Barrera. Fuck, dude, the guy had an entire career before that, 30 something fights before that fight. I'm not making excuses for him. It's his fault. He should have been training. He should have been more into it. I can't, that's him. That's on him, not me. But to pretend that he didn't have a full career before that's kind of foolish. I will admit that the last few years were frustrating when there were a handful of like mandatory or like top contender uh type of fighters that he could have fought and didn't. That sucks,
Yep.
but whatever. Anyway, he wasn't total trash. That being said, yeah, dude, Barrera dismantled his ass. He definitely stayed composed. He stayed disciplined. He did what a lot of people thought he could not do, and it was overall really exciting. It's a pretty highly rewatchable fight. It's got some great gems from Big George on that shit, saying crazy shit. It's great. He's a
Oh, and he
puncher.
also, Big George also, called out Lampley because Lampley made a controversial comment about, um, Islam, didn't he, or something about Allah?
Dude, yeah, that's another thing actually. That's a good point. Is that especially now, rewatching the broadcast, especially because this was what, like 5, 6 months before 9/11,
Mm.
2001. So that already is going to cloud the hindsight of just of a lot of people watching it. And at the time, though, it was far less. I don't want to say sinister because that's not correct, but you know what I'm saying. Like it had far less. It had a totally different connotation or feeling at that time. Although it still felt kind of weird because I remember watching that shit, and before the fight, Hamed like made like a speech, and it wasn't the first time he'd done that. He'd done that before, like where he had offered like a part of a prayer or something like that in Arabic, and he basically said, I think it's like the one of the opening lines of the Quran or something like that, and it was translated into English and blah blah blah, and then they immediately like kind of went into a short conversation between the commentators of like what the fuck was that all about type of thing, and Big George was just like, don't do that shit, like don't be all fucking weird about one but not the other, like what the fuck. That was
Yeah.
basically what it was.
Yeah, there was a I have to go back and watch it now. It's been actually a number of years since I've seen it. And I'm curious though, before we move on to another one, had I don't want to say had Hamed hung down because I really don't think had he beaten Barrera, he was going to stay that much longer as a career. Like he would have taken maybe another big fight or two, maybe Morales, for example, or like Paulie Ayala. Maybe it would have been another one thinking about it, like around the time period. But like, I don't, I can't see. I don't know. Like for example, like there's one fight I think about sometimes. I'm like, how would it have gone Hamed before the wheels fell off? Like still relative prime. Soon after beating Steve Robinson against Pacquiao.
That was actually a far more possible fight than many people think. That was actually mentioned also in one of the Ring magazines at the time, like
Hmm.
right before the Barrera fight. They were basically like, "Oh, there's this kid Pacquiao who's made some waves, blah blah blah." So it's not totally accurate when people are just like, "Oh, nobody had heard of Pacquiao before he bought Barrera." That's not true at all.
I mean,
You know,
I knew who Pacquiao was only
yeah,
because of
they'd done a
what
number of
Pacquiao.
stories on him
Yeah.
in the ring and shit. He
He
wasn't
was actually the
unknown.
he was actually the fighter of the month when he beat Sasaku for the flyweight title.
Yeah, I'm not trying to say he was a household name. I'm just saying he was not unknown in boxing
Mhm.
circles.
Exactly.
But that being said, there's fucking no question that Hamed was already, on the way out or whatever. But they were also talking about, or not they were talking about, Morales was talking about, he was calling out Hamed for like probably about a year or two before that happened. And I mean, that would have been a highly interesting fight, especially because Morales is more of like a fucking spiteful fighter. Like he would have like tried to whoop Hamed's ass. Like he wouldn't have been
Yeah,
like,
1000%.
he wouldn't have been like, oh, let me fucking like box, jab, 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 jab your ass. He would have been like, oh, I can hit you with the jab. Let me hit you with fucking 19 right hands too. And then, like that would have been like, oh shit. He would have put himself in danger for sure. But I kind of get the feeling that he would have beat the shit out of Hamed personally,
Yeah. I mean, he had a better chance of getting caught with
respectfully.
something. There was a good chance of him getting caught with some shit, which I think he would have taken. But he definitely would have got hit because he had that type of style where he did get, especially back then when he was, super aggressive. Another one to add to that list too, who was dying to fight Hamed, and it's all up in the magazines and everything too, was a young Floyd Mayweather when Mayweather was a junior lightweight because Mayweather knew back then.
Yeah, I brought that up not that long ago. Yeah.
Absolutely. Mayweather was dying to fight Hamed. That was the dude he was calling out over and over in the magazines and early online, websites and wherever
Dude, he was at
anyone wanted to
130 and
interview him.
Hamed's at 126. It's
Yeah.
really not that, it doesn't sound that crazy at the time. You know what I'm saying?
And obviously, I mean, who was Mayweather going to fight at 130 at that point that was going to command the money that Hamed would have given him? Like, Mayweather was looking for that big ass payday. And that's what Hamed was commanding. Hamed was the money man at that time. You know what I mean? With the
Yep.
HBO and everything else going on. So
Well, and
Floyd,
that was around when Corrales was in jail.
yeah. And then I remember too because they had one of those things where it was remember the KO where they would date like the four people and they would ask who wins the potential fight between
Yep.
so and so.
Yeah.
And I forgot who it was. It was Hamed and somebody. I probably Barrera. Who the fuck knows? But it was like a potential fight between Hamed and somebody, and Mayweather was one of the panelists. And Mayweather, it might have been Angel Man Freddy. I have no idea. But Mayweather was a panelist. Mayweather was like, no, Hamed should be fighting me. The whole time he didn't say anything about like actually predicting who would fight, potential fight. He was saying why he should fight Hamed and what he would do to Hamed if they fought. That was his whole thing. And he was like, the prince needs to stop running. He needs to get in the ring with the pretty boy and blah 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 blah. Like
Yeah, he he would have
honestly,
he would have eaten him
Lloyd,
alive.
Floyd would have beaten the shit out of Hamed. I'll say
Yeah,
that.
he would have ended
Absolutely.
his shit, bro.
Like, just in every which way. And Floyd knew that, one. And two, he knew that would be on pay-per-view because of just the thing
Oh
with
yeah, he knew he
yeah,
could bank off that for sure.
absolutely. And he was trying to get there early on, and that Hamed was going to be his ticket. But unfortunately, I think he realized quickly too that ship was going to sail once like he was going to have to move to 135. Hamed was still being funky and just whatever. But yeah, Floyd definitely wanted that.
Yeah, I remember that shit there because it was in like a few different like interviews and stuff like that. He brought it up more than once.
Oh yeah, he wanted him bad. Absolutely. Once Corrales came back on the scene, and then they were like, okay, fine, we'll make that. But it took Floyd, let me say, it took him a long time until the Gotti fight to get on pay-per-view.
That's for
And,
sure. Yeah.
think about the Hamed fight. If that potentially happened, that would have had, Floyd would have been on pay-per-view years before that. I don't think he would have been a pay-per-view star initially. He would have beat Hamed, probably went back on HBO a couple more times, but for the right opponent, he would have gone, eventually, I think he would have been a pay-per-view star quicker, obviously, yeah, but
Yeah, had he leaned into the villain role earlier, it would have happened earlier, probably. Because earlier in his career, people just thought of him as like a whiny little baby. Like, oh, you're getting paid millions and you're fucking whining about it. What the fuck? And then later on, he was just like, turned more villain, and people are like, oh, now I want to see him get his ass kicked. And that's when
sure.
he realized, I gotcha. Anyway,
So next one brings us actually not that far away from where you are at. We go back to 1996. So back then, as I was becoming a boxing fan and like, learning about the different champions and all that, I'm assuming the same way you were back then. You're going through like Ring Magazine, KO Magazine, and Boxing Illustrated, Boxing Digest. And I always noticed that Boxing Illustrated, Boxing Digest would give more attention to the WBO champions I wasn't recognized. I didn't really know about back then, right? Like a lot of the European guys, like they would have like fights about like Robbie Reagan, for example, who I think beat Daniel forgot the guy's last name, Daniel something, for like the WBO bantamweight championship, or like Paul Weir fighting Jake Matlala, or like Graziano Rochigiani. But like they would like put focus on WBO title fights. I'd be like, who the fuck are these guys? You know what I mean? Because they're all just people that run from America. And the welterweight champion back then was the for the WBO was a guy by the name of Eamon Lochran, who I don't know, like I wasn't a guy I was really familiar with as a kid, but obviously, he had a long career, successful career, in fact, on the UK scene, beating, a bunch of guys, some of them recognizable names like Donovan Boucher, for instance, Alessandro Duran, which was for the WBO belt. But again, the WBO title back then was one of those belts that it wasn't really big in America. You know what I mean? It wasn't really like universally recognized over here. Like, if the right guy held it, for instance, a guy like Riddick Bowe, even if Riddick Bowe, excuse me, I'll take that back because when Bowe held it, I don't really remember HBO actually promoting him as like, oh, he's a WBO heavyweight champion. Like, he had the belt, but they weren't going over the top saying, he's the champion. You know what I mean? Like, they kind of did it with Tommy Morrison, but still, I don't know. Depending on who the champion was, they weren't really giving it credits. You know what I mean? But like, in Europe, it was big. You know what I mean? Ben had been WBO champ. Other guys had been WBO champion. Like it was like looked upon as like a respected belt, and Lochran was looked upon as a respected champion. In fact, enough that there was discussions reading about it in Boxing Illustrated and other stuff after like a couple of defenses that they were looking upon. I guess DeBella, for instance, was like looking about a little bit into potentially matching him with Whitaker on HBO. Like he was going to make a big splash in the U.S. I guess in a high profile fight, but all he had to do in 1996 was get by an unknown Mexican fighter who had a record of 36-3, but was completely unknown by the name of Jose Luis Lopez, and the fight didn't last a minute.
Lopez is one of those dudes who's always fun to talk about because I get to mention that he was a surfer who literally in multiple interviews was like, you know, I could be training, but I would rather be out surfing and then come back and smoke some weed and hang out with my girlfriend.
Yes, 1,000%. That was one thing that they always talked about Lopez after he became champion. In fact, was that he was strong, He was extremely talented. The fact that like he could have been almost gifted in the ring, but he was lazy as fuck, and all he wanted to do was hang on the beach and surf and smoke and drink. Basically, just
Relatable
20
as
something year old,
fuck.
just be like a normal early 20s person enjoying it.
Relatable as fuck. Yeah, in 2025, that guy would easily be the most popular fucking fighter.
Oh yeah, everyone would love him. I mean, and so, but like Lochran, he became champion in let's see, 1993. Wow. All right, I didn't even know it was that far back. But again, like it falls so far under the radar that like, when your title fights are all taking place basically in his hometown of Belfast and all that, that like no one really knows that's even happening. I mean, like Ring Magazine was not, like I said, it was not, Brian Dugan wasn't like putting in these in their ringside reports about his title fights. But most of the times you would just find them in little blips in Boxing Illustrated. Like I said, that's how I knew who he was. But then, um, yeah, my package got delivered. um, but then you would have it where I remember just seeing it though, and I remember like he had a title defense against Lopez. Not that I knew I was looking forward to it, but just I remember opening the magazine and I see a photo of Lopez, and they're like, "Oh, fighter of the month, WBO champion, new WBO champion, Jose Luis Lopez." And Boxing Illustrated was a color magazine at that point before Ring and KO and the rest of
Yep.
them turned over. So you see him and he looks smiling. I was like, "Who's that?" And then I flipped the page and I see Lopez move into a neutral corner, and I see Lochran crumpled in a corner like this, just completely devastated, right? Like it looked like, bro. I mean, it just looked like so like when a wrestler is just beating the corner and someone takes the trash can and starts slamming them and all that. Like, in the corner, that's how he looked. The poor guy just looked absolutely bushwhacked. And I'm like, oh my God, who the fuck? I was like, what the fuck happened to him? And it took me a number of years before I was able to see that fight. And when I did, it was one of those broadcasts that they used to have back then where, they would have the UK commentators, oh, good evening and da 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 da. And we're here and like it always be in some like really intimate hall setting too that like only seated a few thousand, like nothing like crazy arena or whatever it may be. And like, you have the people there and stuff. Then they just get completely silent when the dude just gets like skull fucked immediately. Like Lopez comes in there swaggering. You can tell like he's a young kid because he just has this like young kid arrogance about them. You know what I mean? The type of one that like these people can't fuck with me. Like this is like child's play to me. Like he's not taking it seriously, but he just goes in there, pow, 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 like oof. And that changed the course of a lot of things right there. In the sense that one, Lochran's career was completely was finished. He never fought again. He suffered a leg injury in the fight. I think that was the one that really exasperated him not being able to continue. But also too, it was just Lopez fucking just beating his head like a drum. And then Lopez immediately after that fight went from being an unknown to being right in the mix of people like, oh shit, because unlike Lochran, who is based out in like Ireland and the UK, and I don't, I'm gonna assume it was like Barry Hearn or somebody that was promoting him back then, but like it's kind of hard for him to come over to the US without a fan base. I mean, he had fans over here obviously that have probably been following him, but like just trying to bring him over as opposed to like a Mexican dude who hits super duper hard and like we said has a funny backstory where he just doesn't give a shit and wants to hang on the beach. Well, that's a lot more marketable to bring over, you know what I mean? And that's how it went. Like Lopez quickly became like one of those guys that's like, oh shit, like who is this? And he became a dark horse in the division immediately because his next fight immediately after that, I believe, was against Yori Boy Campos, who at that time, correct me if I'm wrong, still only had one loss. Like his only loss was in
Yep.
Trinidad. Like, right?
Yep. Yeah.
So
Super understandable loss where he almost lost his fucking head.
yeah. Oh my God, what a nasty knockout.
Yeah, just like one
But
of those like against the ropes, and he's just like
yeah.
awful, terrible.
But I believe that was his only loss after that point, up to that point. And even though Lopez had destroyed Lochran, he was still an unknown commodity. And by the time him beating the daylights out of Campus and stopping him, I think it was like 5 rounds or so, that was like, oh shit, like this dude's the real deal Holyfield. And then he fights like Corte. That was a fight I was really looking forward to on HBO. Actually, no, I don't believe. I believe actually I take that back. His first fight on HBO, and again, this is why I love Boxing After Dark, is because they would just make these like cool fights like this. His first fight was against Aaron Davis.
Superman Davis, yeah.
But yeah, criminally underrated fighter because Davis was one of those guys that even though he lost his title to Meldrick Taylor in like Jesus 1991 or something, like way back when, he was still a tough contender who was had trouble getting fights though against really good guys because he was such a dangerous guy to fight. And he was almost impossible to knock out. I don't believe he was ever knocked out in his
Yeah,
career.
just another
And
one of those like, came around at the wrong time guys.
yeah, totally. But it's a really hard luck, really good fighter who got like, questionable decisions put against him. And he took Lopez the limit. Like Lopez really had to scrape to like win that fight. It was a really close fight. And one of those that like basically showed what boxing after dark was all about back then. But Lopez from there moves on and like I said, he fights Ike Quartey. And that's one of those such an odd fight because like Quartey dominates it for the majority of the time just with his jab, and Lopez is literally doing nothing. He's just
Yeah,
falling.
he's fucking around. And then when
Yep.
he decides to open up, he drops his ass. It's
Yeah.
like,
Every time he actually decided to throw a punch, Corte was like, "Whoa, shit!"
yeah.
And just it would just be like, "Yo, I don't want anything to do with this." You know what I mean? It would just start. And Corte was not a guy who usually did that. Like Corte
No,
would,
like he was usually down to scrap.
yeah. And and correct me if I'm wrong too, Pat, but like when like Lopez would hit him, it didn't even look like he was hitting. I mean, like late in the fight when he dropped him, that was a heavy knockdown. But like earlier in the fight when he hit him, like that didn't seem like it was that hard. Like Corte was just kind of like, "Oh, word, I'm just gonna sit back here and
Yeah, he's like, all
like
right,
he
well, I
like
can
that,
use my
yeah.
jab then, I guess.
You know what I mean? I'm gonna be over here. Take this, would you?" And then,
Well, I mean, I guess in Ike's defense, dude, and I could be incorrect, but if I remember correctly, I think what happened was that Lopez gave up the WBO title because he was like not going to make 147 anymore because he was, he's like, fuck it, moving up to 154 pounds. But then he got opportunities back at 147 because, again, this was kind of a weird time for the welterweight division. It was more unified during the 1980s. And by the time the belts were all split up, and then of course the WBO comes into the equation, there's multiple champions. But then in the late 1990s, it starts to become a fairly deep division with a lot of competition in it. And so while all that's being ironed out and shit, Ike Cortez definitely toward the top of the division, and Lopez he could have been if he would have not been lazy or whatever. And had he held on to that WBO title, he might have been able to do more with it, but he didn't. And like I said, I think that 154 pounds also suited him okay because he was a heavy puncher and he was a big welterweight too. Like in welterweight, he was a fucking big fighter.
oh, he was a big boy. Yeah, yeah. He
So
was, and
in Ike's defense, like he was fighting against a guy who I think was naturally a little bit bigger. But that being said, yeah, dude, he didn't like getting hit by those shots.
yeah, you could just see it in his eyes. He was just like, "All right, this ain't Obakar or somebody like that he could like kind of overpower." But to add on to that really quick, the last I'll say about Lopez is that, like, again, he did kind of squander it because soon after that fight, James Page. So, for
Same
instance,
shit, the exact same shit.
yeah. So James Page, how he gets into the equation is on the undercard of Lopez Corte was Pernell Whitaker against Andre Pastrayev, a Russian fighter who was a contender. Awkward guy, but not really a world beater. Anyways, that was Whitaker's first comeback fight, I think, after De La Hoya, wasn't it? And Whitaker didn't look great in that fight. I mean, like, he won it, but like he just meh. And the most memorable thing about it afterwards was Pastrayev's two managers who looked like gangsters running into the ring and throwing a fucking fit, like just stomping around and throwing things in the air and just losing it. But Whitaker subsequently would fuck happened. Whitaker would
He,
test positive
yeah,
for
he tested
cocaine.
positive,
Tested positive for cocaine after the fight.
and he got
And
arrested or
and
something
then
like
he got
that right
arrested
around
because he
then.
was supposed to fight Corte for the WBO belt, for the WBA belt, and then that fell apart. Corte, I believe, gives up the belt, doesn't he? Because somehow James Page and Pastrana fight for the vacant title.
Yeah, something
Okay.
happened with it because
Corte
yeah,
gets
like
the belt, I'm assuming maybe to fight Oscar, I don't know, but like whatever. So Pastrana fights James Page for the WBA title. Page blasts him in a ridiculously nasty knockout. And then Page fights Jose Luis Lopez. And like you said, Lopez again. just same thing. Fights like a zombie the whole. I mean, he fought a little bit more excited this time with a little bit more energy, but still like enough that a guy like James Page, who shouldn't have been. And James Page was a good fighter. Don't get me wrong. He had a good left hook and he was a good overall boxer, but he shouldn't have beaten a guy like Lopez if Lopez
No.
wanted to try.
Yeah, Lopez could have and should have won that fight.
The only other interesting thing about that card I'll mention is that during between rounds of one of the fight, I think because the ring logo was extremely slippery that night, like even more so than like the normal shenanigans all happened. Like it was fucked up. And Page slipped like 4 times in that fight, in addition to getting dropped like legitimately twice. And everything was just really bad. And at one point, the late great Jay Larkin, the executive producer over at Showtime, the head guy, he ran into the ring with a bottle of Pepsi and like a paper towel and something else, and like shook the shit out of the bottle, sprayed it all over the canvas, wiped it up, and then there wasn't an issue after that. And then he
Yeah,
said
'cause he's all
afterwards,
sticky.
that his wife was a dancer, and she taught him that trick a long time ago, I guess, for something he had to use it that second.
He's like, ballet, ballet.
Yeah.
You're like,
And then they said it, and there's a photo of him. You see it with a bottle spraying it, and with his towel
hey,
rounds.
redneck solutions. You know what I'm saying? Whatever.
And imagine a commissioner trying to tell him, "Hey, you can't come in the ring." He's like, no. He was like, "You do know I put on this entire show, right? Fuck
Yeah.
out of my way before I get you fired." So I wanted
Well,
to bring that up because that was a random one.
and think of with all of that, had things gone just a little differently, dude, we could have gotten Felix Trinidad versus like Corte. We could have gotten Felix Trinidad versus Lopez.
That was discussed. Yeah, De La Hoya.
Damn. So fucking close, dude. Those are some fucking Bombay fights that could have happened that never did. God damn.
De La Hoya was even quoted as saying that he felt Lopez was the most dangerous of them all. If he had to fight them, he was like saying, "He was like, I'd do something about him." And I think Oscar would have beat him, but yeah, that would have. Just one of those what ifs. I mean, everyone likes to bring up Ahado and stuff like that, but I mean, this is a guy who really just came out and was just like, "I'm talented at boxing, but I'd much rather just fuck off."
Yeah, that's true. Especially because there were a lot of people at the time who kind of saw through the Bajado. They were like, "Yeah, he's loud, he's aggressive, but like, what is this kid doing?"
Yeah,
But yeah, Lopez, he was the goods, dude. He did have the goods. He just didn't have the motivation, I guess.
sure.
Wonder what that dude is up to.
Probably on a beach. I would definitely hang with him and smoke a J.
Sometimes I look up and wonder if we're looking at the same moon. Yeah, I wonder. I wonder what that. I
I would buy
wonder
him
what
a beer
happened with that
somewhere.
guy.
Absolutely.
Fuck that. No, that's a really good one, dude. That's I actually wasn't expecting that one. That's a fucking good one. I got one that is. I'm sorry to say it's somber, and it's not that I wanted that. I'm not using it to talk shit, of course, but I do feel like it is one of those fights that should be brought up in this rivalry or whatever you want to call it, just in the terms of the history of it, and also because it was, um, how should I say, it was a moment that affected British boxing quite a bit more than I think it affected U.S. boxing, despite the fact that it was broadcast on U.S. TV. Dude, I think that it really impacted British boxing quite a bit, and that's Lupe Pintor versus Johnny Owen.
Yeah, I knew you were going there. Definitely.
Yeah, and it's one of those fights that's like, I've brought this up before, and it's like people don't want you to talk about these fights, like, and I don't mean like you and me specifically, but like in general, you know what I'm saying? Like when there are fights that are like, Mancini Kim and Emil Griffith, Perret, and stuff like that, that you kind of have to like navigate it a certain way. And if you don't, people get upset. And one of the things is that you can't really go like, oh, it was a good fight. Because if you said, people are like, oh, what the fuck?
Yeah.
It's like, I'm not trying to be rude. And this is kind of like one of those fights where there were moments of it where there was actual good quality in the fight and stuff like that. But yeah, it obviously ended very, very poorly. And Lupe Pintor was the WBC bantamweight champion, hard hitting champion, good obviously Mexican fighter for the purpose of this discussion. And he had built up a little bit of a following in the 70s and 80s. Like I had kind of mentioned before, in Southern California area, there was a bit of a lull and then a resurgence in like the Olympic Auditorium and the Forum and stuff like that, for popularity for when it comes to boxing. And Johnny Owen was a dude who was a Welsh dude that they called the Merthyr Matchstick or the Matchstick Man because he just had a very like peculiar look to him. Like, I'm not trying to be an asshole when I say this, but he definitely had a very strange look to him, almost like he had some sort of like condition or something, you know? Like he was like like overly gangly, you know, had a very like kind of crooky nose, um, just almost, my point being almost like he doesn't really look like somebody you'd see in a boxing ring because he has features that you would see somebody like go after or like that would stick out and like gonna get beaten up and stuff like that. But nonetheless, he was actually a pretty good fighter and he seemed to kind of carry the hopes and dreams of British boxing with him in this instance, especially in hindsight. So in any case, he was a European bantamweight champion at this time. And so like we were talking about in the previous fight, and like we've mentioned on numerous episodes before this, there were other eras where being a regional champion, like a European champion or a British champion, might mean a little bit more toward the world title picture than it does now, generally speaking. And so when somebody's the European champion, generally speaking, that also means that they were the British champion. If it was a British fighter, because it's like you go from the British level to the European level, et cetera, et cetera. So he was good enough to be the European bantamweight champion in that regard, but he did fairly well against Pitor early, and then just wound up losing steam.
Yeah, it's a very touchy subject when you talk about any of these fights. And I mean, 1980s, especially with the advent of like network television of like, a lot of these fights being broadcast out there and
Yeah,
just the world seeing this shit, up close and personal. Like, the first time, think about it, like when Emil Griffith killed Benny Paret on television and the world saw that. And that took boxing a long time to recover from seeing, a guy like publicly get killed. And then starts happening in the 80s, a few times, like the most glaring instances, whereas the one that we just brought up right there. And then, a few years later with Ray Mancini killing killing. And it's like Pintor was one of those guys back then, was that like he became champion almost on a fluke. Like no one even took him seriously initially because of how he won the championship against Carlos Zarate. And Zarate was one of those guys that like long-term champion from the early 70s and just like the king of the division. And even though he had lost to Wilfredo Gomez in 1978 when moving up, like people kind of wrote it off as if like, okay, well, it wasn't that big of a deal. One, he was moving up. Two, he was battling the flu. And three, Gomez was just absolutely sensational, and people would find out he's one of the greatest fighters of all time. So whatever. But Zarate still, like, he goes back down and he fights Pintor in 79. And like, even though Zarate might be slowing down slightly, like he wasn't like the fucking dynamic force when he was knocking out Zamora, he still basically did what he wanted with Pintor to the point that like I think it gets a little overstated how wide the fight was. Pintor did come on, but Zarate won comfortably enough.
yeah,
You
he
know what I
should
mean?
have won. Yeah.
Absolutely. Definitely should have won. And so for Pintor getting a decision that he clearly, even when he gets his arm raised, he's like, word? Yeah, in it that like that's not really like a good start to his reign. And then from there, he loses a non-title fight. In fact, he gets stopped at one point in a non-title fight. Beats Superfly Sandoval, who was a really good fighter back then, but a guy that like always couldn't get over the hump and become a world champion. And then he fights a draw with Ijiro Murata, who was another guy from that era who tough as nails, but just couldn't get over beating a guy like either Pinto or Jeff Chandler. So that brings us into the Johnny Owen fight. And Johnny Owen, like you said, had a commanded, career of 25-1 at that point, and his only loss, um, which I believe was for the European Championship to a Spanish fighter, he ended up regaining and avenging that by decision in a rematch right before he fought Pintor. And there's been books on Owen that I can't say I've read. Like, I've read a lot of stuff on him, and I've read about the fight and just like, his journey to the US and how he became a fighter and how his parents were worried about him because of, like you said, his build. Like he looked extremely fragile. Like everything was just, if you look like if you touch him, like you think you might break something on him, you know what I mean? From like his nose and his skeletal structure and everything. He was a very, very
Yeah,
strong
I'm
guy.
yeah, I know you're not trying to be mean. I'm not trying to
No,
be
I mean
mean.
it's just
He
literally how he
looks
was
like
built.
somebody who would have been
Yeah.
like picked on in school or something. You know, because he
And I'm
looked so
pretty sure he
slight and
was like he was
fragile.
the guy that like had to get into boxing because like I mean built like that you gotta defend yourself and he was a hell of a fighter, like a hell of a fighter. Like I mean he could box. He had underrated power. Like he was a really really good fighter and he fought some good names too, including stopping guys like Davey Vasquez, who was a 72 Olympian for instance. But by the time he fights Pintor, I mean it's a fight that I don't know how the general public was looking at it. I'd have to go back and like read, reports and stuff like that. But I mean, it was like you said, it was a really competitive fight, but one that like you just got the sense that he was you were worried about Owen because like Pintor's punches were so much hard, like hard. He was a thudding puncher, and Owen was wilting throughout it. You know what I mean? You see his face like swelling up, and it's also too. It's just like it was bad, but he was also outboxing Pinto at points and also outfighting him. Pinto was the type of guy that like he could go into lulls sometimes, and that's how he ended up losing non-title fights and also losing decisions to guys he shouldn't have lost to because he can go into lulls and just let himself get outboxed, and he would lay on the ropes and just try to counter off of that sometimes, and let himself take punishment. And a guy like Owen, who was a consummate puncher, like he kept on going. He was a lot of forward motion and threw a lot of fucking punches because he had to was outworking Pintar and was like, no, if he wasn't just hanging in there with him, he was like outworking him and doing this and doing that. And um it was awesome, you know what I mean? Like he was really doing his shit. And it was like, but at the same time, the momentum would go back and forth and it looked like Owen was winning and he was winning at some points on the scorecards, but like Pintar too, you just got the sense that like once he was really gonna turn it on, that was gonna be lights out for Owen. And I don't want to mean it as an
The
Owen like
gas
that, but
tank was
like
going like,
yeah, yeah. And what round was it that he go? Oh, it was what round did he get dropped in? Was it like round nine or so initially, and then
yeah,
I just
ninth,
brought up.
ninth.
So yeah, he got dropped in the ninth, and then um finished in the 12th. And it's like when he got dropped in the ninth, I don't know if they should have stopped it again. Again, I haven't watched it in a minute, so I'd have to go back now, but like sure, obviously you wouldn't want to stop, but like at that point you could just see that like the tide had completely turned and it wasn't gonna end well. But I mean, by the time he got stopped in the 12th round, the way he visibly collapsed, that was just bad. And it just didn't look good because it was just the way he fell. It was just like,
Yeah,
in sections. One of those that kind of like with Dooku came and those other guys too, like they fight until their very end and then they just have nothing. And then when they collapse, that's just
like
it.
folded. You know what I'm
Yeah,
saying? Where
exactly.
it's like, well, and there's a, and not that we're trying to like, we're not fucking physiologists here and shit, but nonetheless, it's like we've seen a lot of knockouts. We've seen a lot of fucking knockouts. So I mean, there tends to be a difference between when somebody gets like put down and they're kind of like fuck, and they get like knocked to the canvas, and when somebody goes and it's almost like they got shot in the head and their body just like follows them. You know what I'm saying? Like, and that's what this looked like, where he just folded back, and it's like, that shit looked ugly, bro. And he just well he the first two knockdowns, like the one in the ninth, he didn't look good, and it looked like he was fading, but he got up and he kind of like was like grabbing the ropes and got up and shit. And then the second knockdown, there was a much heavier knockdown, and he made his way to his feet, but then it was like one shot after that and boom, that was out, dude. And he was unconscious and never came back. That was it. And I think that it was a shock. A lot of it was also that I think that he was overseas and people kind of felt like he went and like got sacrificed to the champion type of thing, when obviously that was not the case, and that was not, he was a competitive fight, especially in spots. But it was they took it rough. They did not take it well, understandably.
Also, too, if correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure the crowd were absolute pieces of shit to Owen after he got dragged out, like, pelting him with shit and stuff like that, weren't they? Because he was
I
stretching
don't
out of
know.
the. I feel like I've read that like, cups of urine and other things were being like trounced on him, which I hate to say it, but I would not be surprised, and especially with LA crowds back then, that sometimes when things would happen, like they got a little rowdy, and
I
like
Well, it was at the Olympic, and I can definitely tell you at the Forum and the Olympic, they had like several different times where there were fights where there were like riots and fucking, fans not being super nice.
And I just feel like I've read that before in other accounts that just saying that Owen and his cornermen definitely didn't have the easiest time navigating themselves out of there to get attention. The way they could have, but I don't think that was going to save him regardless, how quickly they could get him out of there. Like Owen was in bad shape. He had taken a lot
Yeah,
of punishment. And I believe to the doctors and people that examined him afterwards, and even ones before that said that he had like this fragile type of syndrome where like his skull and brain were more prone to injury than the
yep,
average person just because of how he was built. Like he shouldn't
right.
have been a fighter, but
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah, I don't know the name of the condition, but you're 100%. And like I said that before, and I'm trying to emphasize, I'm not trying to be mean or cruel at all. But he did have that kind of look of somebody where like something's a little off. Like he was so slight and fragile looking. And it turned out, I mean, it's almost a miracle that he lasted that long then.
yeah,
Because it's not like he was not the kind of fighter who had like a tremendous defense or something like that. He got
yeah.
hit.
That's what I said. He was a volume puncher. Yeah, a boxer. Yeah.
So yeah, it turned out I don't remember what it was, but there was something here. I wrote on it here. A condition that made his skull fragile and his jawbone stronger than normal, which meant that he could, at least in theory, take punches on the jaw better than the average person, but that his actual skull and his ability to absorb, shock or whatever through his skull was not good. And yeah, he that's how he died, unfortunately. But that does contribute to this Mexico versus UK rivalry thing. It's just that obviously not the way that anybody would want it to.
Sure, but there is. I don't know. There's nothing about happy about this story ending, but if there is like some sort of like good area about this is that Pintor did eventually make a trip to Owens's hometown. I want to say in the early 2000s because it was documented in Ring magazine.
Hmm.
And they were in color at that point, so this had to be the 2000s. And Pintor visited the statue that they erected for Owen over there, and he got to meet Owen's parents and embraced with them and stuff like. I think he was there for the unveiling or whatever it was. I don't know, but he was there for some kind of unveiling for Owen, and he got to spend time with the parents, which was really good, and they embraced and all that and all this other stuff. So there was like some kind of like at least a good ending on that sense. You know what I mean?
Closure or
Or
whatever.
yeah,
Yeah.
closure exactly. There was closure with that, and you could see like the emotional feeling when there was a photo of Owen's dad holding Pintor by his chest and like Pintor kind of leaning back into him, like being held. You know what I mean? And you see Pintor like just with the emotion on his face, and Owen's dad too, and it's a touching moment. It really is, and it's good to when there's some type, like you said, when there was closure like that. For instance, like Emil Griffith, meeting Benny Paret's kid at the end of that documentary, and them having like the moment together and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Or Gabe Relis, finally making peace with Jimmy Garcia's family, things like that.
No, yeah, 100%, dude. It's tough to yeah, there's no good, there's no good about it, and while there might be some sort of poetic or heroic story to it, it's awful, and at the end of the day somebody was lost.
Yeah,
But yeah, that definitely is one of those kind of stories where it's nice somebody's able to make peace or whatever. And one of those kind of unique things about boxing, although, not the greatest unique thing.
sure.
That said, carrying on with this Mexico UK business, we got another one we can jam in there.
Yeah, so I like to go with the obscure ones that no one will try to think of. And just because I don't know, they were interesting, but we're still sticking with the 80s at that point, at this point. So the 80s welterweight division we're going to right now. And it's like, it was an interesting time because during the early 80s, you had Sugar Ray Leonard dominating it, you had Tommy Hearns dominating, and eventually they move up. Duran moves up, Benitez moves up, and the division is in sort of a scramble. Eventually, Donald Curry comes in and becomes a dominant guy at the division. It looks like he's going to be not only the dominant man of the welterweight division for the rest of the decade, but a guy that's going to eventually overcome the man on your t-shirt, Marvin Hagler, and become the superstar of the rest of the 80s. Like Donald Curry was looked upon as that dude. He was a bad motherfucker. I mean, we've talked about him on the show before. And just, you know, not only did he solidify himself being like the top dog of the division by beating Marlon Starling and, other top guys, but when he decimated Milton McCrory in two gory rounds to unify the welterweight crown, I mean, how can you not think he was going to be the man of the future? Like that was just like a ridiculous knockout. McCrory looked, felt like he was shot. But soon after that, in one of the biggest upsets of the 80s, and maybe the biggest win in British boxing history, aside from Sugar Ray Robinson losing to Randy Turpin, is when Donald Curry loses his belt to Lloyd Honeyghan. And that was a massive, massive upset. I mean, Lloyd Honeyghan was undefeated and, absolutely like a brilliant fighter early on who had some really good wins before he came to the US and also managed by Mickey Duff, another guy, like you said, Duff was that dude back then. And Honeyghan put on an absolutely beautiful performance, you know what I mean? Like he roughed Curry up, he beat him up in the beginning. The fight's shown a lot actually on Tubi, on the Top Rank channel. And it's just interesting to see like and kind of subdued crowd because it's not a huge arena they were fighting in. Just seeing like Curry get taken apart the way he did. Like it's not pretty because Honeyghan wasn't like, like a brilliant boxer. He was kind of crude a little bit here and there, but he just beat the shit out of Curry and stopped him. And then Honeyghan went on a little bit of a tear after that. He beats former champions like Gene Hatcher. I think he knocked him out in the first round. The ghost of Johnny Bumpus in a very embarrassing fight because Bumpus had no business being around a ring, let alone in a title fight at that point. Excuse me. And then he fights the guy that we're getting to the point. I'm getting to the point of Jorge Vaca.
Such a, yeah, just one of those,
And such a random, like, weird rivalry that took place for no reason, too. I don't know.
just one of those events, one of those fights in boxing that just illustrates what kind of shit show it can devolve into totally randomly, like for no reason whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
And it actually it's funny too because I thought about this fight before and it crossed my mind because he had fought Lopez because he
Yeah.
fought Jose Luis Lopez and I was just like and anyway it did cross my mind but yeah dude, Lloyd Honeyghan, very good fighter but also just one of those kind of spotty guys where
Yes.
you sometimes didn't really know what kind of fighter you were going to get. And a guy who is super talented, but then he could kind of get sucked into a different kind of fight, et cetera, et cetera. But then a guy like Jorge Vaca, who was like, seemed obviously like an extremely unlikely. First of all, he was the kind of line on it was that he was an unlikely challenger in the first place. They were like, where'd they pull this guy from? Type of guy. And then the fight itself and the sanctioning body nonsense behind it in two different ways. Jesus Christ, I don't want to take it all from you. I got to leave some of this
No, no, no,
nonsense.
no. Please, please go, go.
Well, I'll say at least one thing here. So the result of the fight obviously was that Jorge Vaca winds up winning the title by a weird fucking technical decision. But because of the nature of the fight, the IBF didn't want to sanction this fight. They were basically like, this is like, lower level bullshit type of thing. We're not sanctioning it.
Yep.
And then because of a different sanctioning organization rule, which helped Honeyghan lose the fight, the IBF then were like, in fact, we're actually taking the title because you lost the non-title fight. How fucking weak is that shit? Fucking IBF. And that would have been Bob Lee era too. So fucking Bob Lee. But in any case, that's what wound up happening with one of the sanctioning body nonsensical things that had. There was an entirely different one that actually caused the ending of the fight, though, or helped
It
the
was the headbutt.
decision go that way. The WBC one,
The headbutt, wasn't it?
yeah, which
Yeah.
which I think is still in place, some places.
Such a stupid, stupid rule that like when a guy has to get a point deducted if he doesn't get cut and the other guy gets cut because you acting like 90% of the time they're trying to he was doing that on purpose or some dumb shit and like that has actively fucked up fights before, most notably Chavez Randall too, where they schemed the belt back
So weak,
or
yeah,
other things
so
of that nature.
dumb.
But it's like Vaca, regardless of the stupidity of the fight, of the ending of the fight, Vaca surprised everybody because, like you said, Honeyghan could be spotty and didn't really look good in this fight at all. He looked really flat. And a guy like Vaca, who was crude as shit, don't get me wrong, a very crude fighter, but strong as hell. He is a strong guy, especially when he was younger. I mean, there's like highlights of him because he fought fucking forever, mind you. And so, there's highlights of him much undersized, getting blitzed by Roy Jones and other guys like that, I mean, pretty badly, in fact. But when he was in his prime as a welterweight, he was a rough and tumble guy, you know what I mean? And like awkwardly effective in his own way. And he was given Honeyghan hell that night, you know what I mean? To the point where it was like a pretty close fight. And then, like we said, the cut happened. And when that happened, and I think it was Vaca got cut, and they go to the scorecards, and because of that, Vaca becomes champion because he was up on it by just like a point or two in each card. It was absolutely ridiculous. And one of those fights that you just kind of like, it was reported on in the magazines. That everyone's just like, yeah, this is bullshit, huh? Whatever. It's an upset, but still, it's like, are you kidding me right now? And they rectified it in the rematch because they fought soon after that. I want to say only 5 months after that, it looks like, in 1988. And Vaca was absolutely blasted out in 3 rounds brutally by Honeyghan. Like, Honeyghan wasn't playing games with that one.
Yeah, he was wasting zero time, dude. He was
Yeah.
just like, all right, dude, you want to fuck around like that? Then let's go.
But I mean, that was really the end of Honeyghan for that matter, too, when it comes down to it, because he has one more title defense, but then he fights Marlon Starling in a unification fight, I believe it was. Let's make sure it was. Yeah. Oh no, it's just for the WBC belt.
Well, and that was really the not the start of the sanctioning body shit, but in the welterweight division, that's when they split up all the titles because
Yeah.
he took them all from Donald Curry, and it was before any WBO bullshit. And so then after that, they started slowly stripping him of the fucking titles, and like, I mean, dude, Honeyghan really got fucked over there.
Totally. I mean, especially if you're not one of the guys they want you to be champion or anything like that, they'll find a way to fuck you to make sure they'll get it off you eventually. Absolutely. And Starling was WBA champion, I still believe at this point. He wasn't stripped or anything like that. He had the bullshit with Aris, but he was still champion. And I mean, Starling put on a career best performance in this one. Like he beat the fucking daylights out of Honeyghan. Honeyghan couldn't do anything with him. Starling, in that peekaboo defense where he just did the shell and just walked him down, kept on walking him down, hitting him with uppercuts, right hands, whatever he wanted, just absolute beatdown. And when he fought Mark Breland in 1990, same thing. Breland was, well, first off, Breland was like a foot taller than Honeyghan. And um, just a monster of a, I mean, like a lanky guy too, but the style was just all wrong. Honeyghan was already past it, and Breland just stomped him badly. But interestingly enough, is that Vaca, like we said, he hung on for a very long time after this, like way longer than anyone could anticipate. But some guys just do shit like that. But one of his biggest wins was after he lost to the rematch to Honeyghan and subsequently lost to Simon Brown. One of his biggest wins was actually stopping Breland and finishing Breland's career before he made a brief comeback in the mid 90s.
Yeah, because well, a guy that we had spoken about a couple minutes ago, Aaron Davis, really helped push him off of the edge,
Yeah, yeah,
unfortunately.
that's right.
And I mean, no disrespect to Mark Breland, when you're that great an amateur and somebody's like, well, he didn't live up to his amateur. It's like, dude, fuck, dude, you can't. Like, when you have that many amateur accomplishments, multiple time Golden Gloves, winner, Olympic gold medalist, etc. And you have all these credentials. It's pretty tough to live up to that as a professional. And also on top of that, he did face some very good fighters during his pro career, and he was a multiple time champion. So to act like he's like some schlub or something like that is
Mhm.
pretty fucking weak. It's dumb. But he clearly did not have the same type of pro career that he had as an amateur career, and he kind of underachieved based on what people thought he would do. And by the time he had to come back from, being upset and then losing to Superman Davis, and I mean, that was a bad knockout too.
Nasty,
And that was a
nasty.
pretty bad, yeah, like, dude, like you could tell that he's not unconscious quite, but he's just like lying there, like, oh, fuck, dude, I hate this, I hate life. And so coming back from that was obviously a pretty tough one. And facing a guy who is not very talented, maybe, but just a bruiser like Jorge Vaca, you don't want that.
No, and I watched the fight not too long ago, and Breland was beating the hell out of Vaca early on, understandably. But then like he just couldn't take him on. And once Vaca realized that Breland kind of didn't have anything for him after the middle rounds, he really turned it on. And poor Breland. I mean, again, it's sad to see a guy as talented as Breland get beat up by a guy like Vaca, but like Vaca was a tough guy. You know what I mean? As crude as he was a tough guy. And I'll even say when he fought Roy Jones, all right, and Jones kills him in the first round. Vaca comes out there swinging. Like he doesn't just go there and just stands on the ropes and just waits for Jones to punch him. Like he came in and he was swinging his ass off and actually connects with a few shots that makes Roy
Yeah,
like
he's like, oh, well, maybe I ought to end this.
yeah, that makes Roy is like, okay, I'm not gonna like coast around. Like you want to play games, I'll just finish you quick. But like, Vaca came out humming. You know what I mean? He was a tough guy. So like it's just an interesting blip in the 80s welterweight history of that happening. You know what I mean?
No, for sure. And I mean, that's like that's one of those fights where it's just like a really big anomaly and fucking weird, strange. Doesn't make much sense.
Yeah. It's just but yet it happened. And it's like yeah, it was just a strange time in the welterweight division at that point because like you had that happening, like we said, Marlon Starling gets knocked out against Marlon Aris after the bell, and no one knows what the hell is happening with that. And yeah, it's just a strange time.
Yeah.
Actually, too, before we move on, man, I'm poor Honeyghan. I watched one of his, I guess it was his last fight, one of them, when he fought Vinny Paz. And dude, I mean, I kind of fast forwarded it to like, the ending because I just wanted to see like Larry Harzard run in the ring. And that was the same thing that happened. Like Paz goes over there, drops Honeyghan. I don't know if it was like Tony Orlando, who the fuck the referee was that was kind of being slow to pulling him off. And you see Hazard yell, and then he jumps over the ring and just runs over and grabs Paz and pulls him off. And it's just like, calm down, calm down. And you hear like the announcers Al Albert, and them like, oh, Larry Harrison jumps in the ring again because like that was like a regular occurrence of him being commissioner back then, stopping fights on his own.
No, Larry, why don't you just settle into the referee role, dude?
Yeah, like he was a ref. If that was the case, then just stay a ref at that point instead of just jumping in and like pushing the actual ref out of the way.
Fucking Larry.
Imagine if
No,
you're the
but I mean, it
referee.
was legit though. It was legit in that
Yeah,
instance.
sure, sure. But there was other times too. Imagine like he just pushes you out of the way and you'd be like, "The fuck is that my boss?" And then he jumps in. I'm like, I'd be thinking to myself, well, I guess I'm fired.
Yeah, exactly. Oh shit, my boss has to do my job.
Yeah, I'm like I'm fucked. Awesome.
Fucking ridiculous, dude. All right, but the last one I got, like I said, I'm not cheating by going more recent, but easy to remember, easy to recall without looking up too much and researching and all that type of stuff. And I remember watching it live, etc. And I'll throw one back since I was cruel to the Brits. I'll give them this one. It's a legit title fight at the very least, in the sense that it was for the lineal or for the ring title, whatever. But it was a result that not a lot of people quite expected, because let's do a little brief breakdown of what was going on in the lightweight division and what was going on in the junior welterweight division in the early 2000s. Lightweight, there was a lot of stuff to iron out because most of the action was coming up from 130. 130 pounds was fucking ripping and roaring in the late 1990s, dude. There was a whole bunch of contenders that were, on the come up, kind of going up and down, guys who were carrying over from the early and mid 90s who were still around and were very good and still contenders, and dudes who, again, like a guys like young guys who were on the come up, Floyd Mayweather, etc., a number of dudes. And then they had kind of were coming up from the lightweight division in the early 2000s. And the lightweight division got pretty fun there for a little while, dude. You had Juan Lescano. That guy was fun for a while, actually. He had a number of really fun fights. Um, Cesar Bazan was a dude who'd also carried over from the late 1990s, et cetera. The Stevie Johnson.
Yeah.
And so the guy who wound up kind of coming out on the top of that heap, at least temporarily, was Jose Luis Castillo, right? And
Mhm.
so that was kind of who, at least initially, had come out on top, and then Floyd Mayweather had moved up from 130, beat him somewhat controversially at the time, but then Floyd defeated him in the rematch and then moved up and blah blah blah, and that kind of left lightweight division a little bit in limbo again, and left it in a position where it can get ironed out again. We all know about Castillo Corrales and their series, but the big takeaway from that, apart from how great the first fight was that Castillo was struggling to make 135 pounds for a few years, and so win or lose, he was planning on moving up and blah blah blah, but that turned into a fiasco with Corrales, and the third fight got axed because he couldn't fucking make weight, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So switched to 140 pounds. I'll try to sum that up. Also, really quickly, 140 pounds in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Also, again, 135, not super great. It was 130 and 140 was where the action was at this time. Castillo was a champion, but he wasn't the dominant champion quite yet until the early 2000s, and the belts were kind of floating around and hadn't been consolidated yet. There was guys like Dios Bellis Hurtado, on the heels or after his comeback from being knocked out absolutely ridiculously brutally by Pernell Whitaker. He was actually a good contender for a little while. Randall Bailey, Miguel Cotto was a prospect. There were other dudes who were around at this time. Arturo Gatti was coming back at 140 pounds. So, dude, these were fucking happening divisions. There was a lot of shit happening. Ben Tacky,
You even
blah,
had
blah,
like
blah.
the fringe contenders like Ben Tacky and
Yeah,
Real
dude, he was a
Era.
fucking monster, bro. Damn near fucking decapitated Roberto Garcia. Phew, that was knockout of the year. Awful. Anyway, fun divisions. And so when Costazu unified the title against Zab Judah, he was obviously seen as the dominant champion of the division. And then Ricky Hatton came from prospect to contender and then absolutely fucking mauled the fuck out of Costazu in their fight. Some say unfairly, whatever you want to call it. Shit was kind of dirty, but regardless, he won. He beat the shit out of him. And by that point, again, Castillo moving up in weight. And after having his troubles, they figured, all right, well, this is kind of like a clash of punchers. This is a clash of aggressive styles. This is going to be a lot of fun. This is going to go rounds, et cetera, et cetera. And it kind of, it was fun for what it was for the first few rounds, but god damn.
Yeah. Talking about yeah, it was one of
Ricky
those
Hatton versus
like
Jose
yeah,
Luis
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Castillo.
No.
We got
Yeah, it
to
was one
give
of those
one
that,
to the
like
Brits here.
oh, absolutely. And it was one of those fights that like everybody I remember because I had this happened in '07. I just started at Showtime. And back then, Showtime and HBO like head to head and like the fights that they were trying to air. And Showtime had aired, like we said, they aired Castillo. They would basically had aired Castillo for a while now at that point. He had been their fighter. It wasn't just the Corrales fights. He fought Julio Diaz on Showtime. He fought Casamayor on Showtime, and he fought
I think Lescano too.
yeah, well, Lascano was pay-per-view. I think it was HBO
Was it?
pay. I
You
believe
might
so.
be right, but I know that he had at least one other one on Showtime though.
But yeah, the other ones, maybe Rolando Reyes. That sounds about right. But
Hmm.
it was, but like Castillo had basically become a Showtime fighter, and then Hatton, like you said, who had been a Showtime fighter too himself, because he up until the Zoo fight, in fact, and then I want to say after Zoo, that's when he made the jump to after it was well not after Zoo, it was after he beat Don Flamenco looking dude there. What's his name?
Oh,
Mouse. Yeah, Carlos Mouse.
yeah, Carlos Mouse.
Yeah. I think it was after
The
him
apostle.
yeah, he became a HBO fighter when he fought what's his face there, the welterweight champion. Um the welterweight dude with the bald head, the Spanish
Oh, Colazo.
Palazzo, Louis Palazzo, yeah. So for Showtime, I remember they were a little annoyed that they lost Castillo for the Hatton fight because like, Castillo was their guy and like that was a big deal. That was like a big fight. And like you said, it was one of those though that like you think about it and on paper it looks like it's gonna be a great fight, but sometimes it just doesn't pan out that way because Castillo, through all the times that at this point too, it wasn't just like first off, it wasn't just the first Corrales fight. Like the man was struggling with weight for a while too. Like you saw how for the second fight he came in overweight. The third fight, I think he literally collapsed right there and was like laying there at the scale, almost out of it, and they had to cancel it and all this other shit. So it was almost like he was kind of a spent guy, and especially too because he went. I remember there was they did a duel fight before that, right? Like Castillo fought Herman and Gojo, who was only like 13-0 or something like that, or like had one defeat, and then Hatton I think fought Yarango,
Mm.
and Castillo didn't look good in that fight. Like, and Gojo ended up being a good fighter who gave like quite a few guys good fights, but like Castillo, and to his credit, should have been able to beat a guy like that pretty comprehensively. And instead, he struggled to the point where he potentially lost that fight. So that didn't look that good going into the Hatton fight. But that being said, I don't think anybody expected Hatton to beat him up the way he did. Hatton just kind of like bullied him around, like you said. Like, there was a few like lively exchanges, but once he landed that body shot, that was just oof.
And at least a brief, very brief backstory on Castillo was that when he was younger, he was. I mean, I don't think that he was a regular sparring partner for Julio Cesar Chavez. Like maybe he was, but I know that he, at the very least, had sparred with him and had been in the gym with him, and that was kind of part of his like mythos, his backstory or whatever. And so I also know that he turned pro when he was like 15 or 16. He had been fighting a long time by that point, not to make excuses for him, but clearly, this is a guy who'd been fighting for a while. What he was not a newcomer. It's not like that, struggling to make weight was something new. He had been for a while, but a lot of people thought like, oh, well, he's not struggling to make 135 anymore. He's gonna be stronger now because he's not dropping that extra 5 pounds. And maybe he really was, and maybe he just didn't get a chance to show it. But maybe he also was shot. I don't know. All I know was that Ricky Hatton, regardless of whatever you think about him, and he was just in the news like 2 days ago because he said he's coming back.
Yeah,
Fuck, don't do it, Ricky. Don't, dude. Anyway, you're not gonna listen to
at least
me,
he's fighting a guy that's like only a year younger than him or something. I don't know, whatever.
Fuckarooski, bro. I hope you get paid, buddy. Anyway, don't do it, but he's not gonna listen to me. But whatever you think of him, extremely good body puncher. His style's the kind of style that's just a nightmare. He doesn't get off of you. He's just in your fucking face all the time, always throwing punches, always trying to give his left hook to the body. And it's terrible. And he landed like the perfect left hook to the body. And I think if I remember correctly, he broke either two or three of Castillo's ribs with that last left hook. Like, I mean, it's loud. He really got around his guard with it. And Castillo kind of like took a step or two, like he was like, "Oh, we're good." Nope, we're not good actually. And then just fucking went and like turned and took a knee. And it was like, it was one of those. It was one of those. He fucked his ass up, bro.
He really did. I mean, Hatton, that was peak Hatton right there. You know what I mean? He still have like much success after that, but like the times he would really get to like the mountain point, he would end up losing like soon after he lost to Mayweather, and then he came back, looked really good against Paulie Malignaggi. Really, really good in that fight, in fact. But then when he fought, look what happened when he fought Pacquiao. That was just that was awful. But like, and I remember that was the early days of Punch Zone, and we were in the studio for watching that. And I think like initially we all thought like we all got like hushed when he dropped the second time. We were like, oh shit, like he died or something. Like this is like really bad. And then you saw him slightly moving. We're like, oh okay, he's cool. Let's celebrate. Like
Yeah. Like, yeah, for a second there, it's one of those where they're like struggling to breathe knockouts where you're like, oh
yeah.
shit.
And he just has that weird grimace of like
Yeah.
something catastrophic just happened to him. And then, you see his poor mom and fiance ringside clutching each other, bawling their eyes out because, well, they saw their guy just get decapitated. Oh, it was bad.
Jesus Christ. Yeah, I mean, understandably, yikes.
And Castillo, I don't really think he fought much more after that either, right? He was scheduled.
No, no,
He was
he
scheduled to
fought
fight
for a
Tim Bradley.
while.
Oh, he did.
Nah, bro, he fight, dude. He was fighting until like
Oh,
I want to say like a few years ago, bro. But now we're about to let's double check.
yeah.
Um,
I don't know. I wasn't really following him that much after that.
okay, 2014. So not a few, but no, he fought. Yeah, he fought for a while after that because actually, one of the things that I remember was that was uh immediate yeah, like 2 fights later. I was gonna say I thought it was the next fight, but it wasn't the next fight. It was 2 fights later. He fought Sebastian Lujan, the guy who
Oh,
Margarito almost fucking
yeah,
ripped
yeah.
his ear
Ripped his
off.
hair off. Uh-huh.
And that was like over as Saquon, just in San Diego, like not too far from where I lived and shit. And it was like sad as fuck because Lujan's his style was all wrong for Castillo in the first place. And
Sure.
then on top of that, it's like washed looking Castillo who drops a decision to Lujan. And I remember that shit. And everybody was all mad because it was like, who the fuck would put him in with there? And anyway, yeah, he fought for a little while after that. And after that, he was pretty much like he was an opponent, dude. He was pretty
I
much
remember at one point he was scheduled to fight Tim Bradley, which would have been awful for him too back then because Bradley was on the come up. But yeah.
yeah,
Uh,
dude. It was
so
ugly.
the last one I'm gonna bring up. So there were a few other ones I was thinking about, and obviously we don't got the time for it. But like there was Anthony Joshua against Andy Ruiz, which I was at their first one. That still remains one of the coolest moments I've ever been ringside for. And also to the series that's never gets brought up anymore between Paul Hoko Hodkinson against Marcos Villasana. And that's an underrated series. Like Hoko Hodkinson was one of those guys that was like really talented fighter, really tough fighter, but unfortunately, he makes Jose Napoles look like I don't know who had really rough skin that barely got cut. Jack Dempsey.
Yeah, something like that.
All right, yeah, I'll use that. Yeah, Dempsey like fucking soaked his face in brine and shit. So like, um, he made Jose Napoles look like Jack Dempsey when it comes to cuts. All right. Like Hawkinson was a bleeder,
Yeah,
a
just
bad,
paper thin
bad,
skin.
oh, bad bleeder. And him and Velasana had some absolutely gory fights, both of them. The first one, Hawkinson was winning, and then his face literally opened up. Like, look at what was that? The pictorial history of boxing. There's a photo of that. There's a photo of it in that magazine. And you see Hawkinson just like both of his eyes are they look like they're about to fall out. It's just gushing everywhere. He's just cut out all over the place. And he was winning the fight. Keep that in mind. He was actually winning the fight and winning it pretty comfortably, but his face just fell apart. And then they had to stop it. He ended up winning the rematch, but like his face just never was able to hold up for a long sustained career. So that being said, the I'm gonna bring up what I feel is the gold standard in the UK Mexico rivalry, and it was a 3 fight series between Hall of Famer Vicente Saldivar and Howard Winstone.
Yeah, dude. Since you shouted out Hodkinson Viasana, I also got to say, from a somewhat similar era, another underrated series has got to be Fidel Bassa versus Dave McCauley too.
Oh
Catch
my
out those
God.
motherfuckers if you've never seen them. Like, yeah, just I mean, nobody brings, especially American fans. They're never gonna bring up those fights, but they're on YouTube. They're easy to watch. Super fun.
Bassa McCully might be the best flyweight fight that's ever been filmed. Like that fight is
Just
absurd.
filthy action.
Yeah. Bassa was such a nasty little fighter too, man. Like stuff bro, like McCully was a tall guy for the division. Like he looked like he should have been a featherweight or something. And think about tall, super lanky. Bassa from what was he from Barranquilla, Colombia?
I think so, yeah.
Was not a tall guy, actually really short, but it's like super muscular, like a really built, well built, just compact, fighter from back then, and just like a Colombian fighter. You know what I mean? How there always is, all of them are always ripped and shredded and just have that certain look to them. And Bassa was a slashing puncher, man. And McCully was beating him up, and it was like just such an ebb and flow back and forth fight where McCully would drop him and Bassa would come back with these ridiculous combinations, and McCully would get dropped, and he looks like he's on the verge of being like, destroyed, and he would come back. Just a brilliant fight. And absolutely, and one that I'm probably going to watch at some point this week now. But
Yeah, I don't think they're gonna be showing those on the fucking channels very often.
nah, if any time ever, definitely not. But Vicente Saldivar was one of those guys that came in during the featherweight era where it was it was a tough era. It was like a really, really tough era. Sugar Ramos was the longtime champion who had beaten Davey Moore and made a number of defenses, but at the same time, he had a couple of defenses that were somewhat controversial. The last one, for instance, against a guy named Floyd Robertson, who was from Accra, Ghana, and
Hmm.
Robertson Robertson, I don't know. It was one of those fights. I think the fight took place in Ghana, right? Didn't it? Robertson and fucking Ramos. But it was like a super close fight, super controversial, whatever it was. Ramos came away with a bullshit win or something like that. And like the Ghanaian government, boxing government, tried to like uphold it and say that Robertson was the champion. Anyways, that's what Sugar Ramos was coming into when he fought Vicente Saldivar. Fights him, and at this point, man, this dude was a brilliant fighter. One of those type of gas tanks that you couldn't penetrate. And you find out too that I think he had the same condition with like Henry Armstrong, where he had like a slow heart or something, a slow heart rate or whatever it was. But he had some type of like slow heart rate or that helped him basically like have like unlimited stamina. Like he was just like that dude would just chug along and beat the shit out of you. But he was also a brilliant boxer too. Just overall one of those guys that encompassed the Mexican style, but at the same time could like box his ass off and just he was an overall great fighter. But he's not really brought up today as one of the remembrances of remembered as one of the all time greats of Mexican boxing, at least among modern fans, because his prime was what almost 60 was over 60 years ago, close to it. And so that being said, he beats the shit out of Sugar Ramos and becomes featherweight champion. And then to right the wrong, he also fights Floyd Robertson and knocks him out in two rounds. Also beats Raul Rojas, who eventually would go on to become champion himself. And um, but then he gets to Howard Winstone, and Howard Winston from Wales, and kind of like the antithesis of what Saldivar was, but just like a brilliant boxer. Just one of those guys that like it's kind of unfortunate for him that he came up at the same era when both of them were at their peak. Because Winston basically had the skills to be like a champion for a long fucking time if he really wanted to. Like this dude could have been a long reigning champion. And he beat everyone that there was around at that point. The only guy he couldn't get past was Saldivar. And all the fights, except for their last one, were extraordinarily close. And the thing about them too, what's interesting is that two of them took place in Winston's backyard.
Well, and if you look to at the defenses of Vicente Saldivar, who was a very, very good fighter, but his nickname was El Zurdo de Oro, which is the left-hander, the golden lefty or whatever, however you want to
Mm-hmm.
characterize that. But I mean, it has nothing to do with Mexican culture or anything like that. Lefties have always kind of been avoided or considered bad luck or etc. Slap whatever fucking stereotype you want on it there, and that's generally how they've always been considered. And the same thing for Saldivar, who was not super popular in Mexico. He wasn't unpopular, but he wasn't super popular either. And so you could see that he makes defenses in London, he makes defenses in the US. And that's not to say that, oh, by definition, therefore he wasn't popular. That's not the case. It was just that clearly he was a little bit more prone to making defenses away from home than you might think a fighter would be if they don't need to. If they're super popular at home and you're selling out and shit like that, you don't need to leave. And that's how a lot of fighters do it. Now, it could have, I suppose, been that he was just a badass who wanted to fucking travel abroad. Maybe. But
A
it
lot of guys,
also,
like we said with Eddie Perkins earlier, is that world traveler too. Sometimes, I mean, Saldivar was a lot more popular than Perkins was. He was probably more popular than Joe Brown was, at least in America. And that being said, though, like you said, he still had to travel around for certain fights. I mean, when he fought in America, he was also fighting like in the LA area, so that was still like a popular area for him. And but for Winston, who I guarantee you was the money involved in it too, that the backers for Winston were like, "Yo, we're
I'm
going to give
sure.
you cannot afford to, you're not going to get the same if we go over there or, some neutral
Well,
site." and
And
he's just
it has to be
yeah.
because he's already 1-0. So you'd think like, oh, well, if he's the champion and 1-0 against this guy, it's your fucking choice. You fight where you want, unless they're offering you a bundle of money to bring it to Cardiff, which they did.
Mhm. And not only that, too, he wins the first fight. It wasn't like he got fucked over. It was an
Right.
extremely close fight, but he still got the decision. So he feels comfortable enough to go back there and he can do it again.
Right.
And and the thing is, it's just like, again, I'd have to go back and watch these because it's been a minute. But I just knew this was like perfect to bring up because like the brilliance that was on display between these two on his fights are just like something to behold, you know. Saldivar gets outboxed for a long periods, but like I also at the same time too, he like the aggressiveness of him and his own brilliance in the boxing just like make it nip and tuck. But it was always at the end of the fights where he turned it on just a little bit more and like the last few rounds that he would like really like edge it to the point where you couldn't question it even if you thought it was close and they'd be razor close fights, but you knew that Saldivar absolutely won them.
Yeah, he was an extremely hard worker in the ring, and he was the kind of fighter where if you didn't show up at 100%, that he was going to fill in that gap. And that's
Yeah,
exactly what he did. Is when you give him those moments to win the rounds, that's what he would do. Is he'd fill in the fucking gap. And that's exactly why they fought three times, though, because you'd figure like, oh, well, he's already 2-0. Why'd they fight three times? Because the first two fights were reasonably close.
exactly. And Winston was undefeated, except for one loss before that. Like Winston was undefeated in the interim throughout all those fights. Like he was beating everyone else that there was around there. Like of course he had to fight him again. That was still his perennial number one contender. I'm sure Saldivar for the third time was just like fuck this guy again. But at the same time, like what are you gonna do? At least this was in his backyard, and then this time Saldivar really put it on him and like whooped him. He dropped him twice, and there was no question about who was going to win that. And so Saldivar retires after this, right? And this is where you feel bad for Winston because Saldivar retires for a couple of years. He would eventually come back, but he retires, and Winston now feels to himself that he has a chance to like actually claim the throne. But it's interesting, like we've talked about with others, that once you lose your head rival, either the fights take something out of you, or just losing that chief guy that you don't have to chase anymore is kind of gone, or maybe a combination of the both, and you're just not really the same anymore. You know what I mean? Like look at Rodrigo Valdez, for instance. Valdez suffered a nasty car accident that definitely hindered him before his first fight with Carlos Monzon and kind of hindered him throughout the rest of his career, especially with his right hand, I believe. But even so, the the way like the aggression and just his overall the fighter of him was just not the same when he fought Munz. I mean, after the Munzon fights, you know what I mean? Like he loses a competitive fight to Munzon the first time, he dropped Munzon in the second time, and was winning up until Munzon, surged and beat him, and then he retired. And after he retires, Valdez now is WBC champion. He beats Benny Briscoe and he makes a couple of defenses, but something's missing from him. He's just like not quite there anymore. And then he eventually loses to Hugo Coro and disappears. And same thing with Winston is that like he loses Saldivar again, and now like when Saldivar retires, he has a chance to like win the vacant title against a Japanese guy. What I don't have what's his name? I gotta look that shit up actually.
Oh man, I'd have to look too. Not gonna lie.
Seki.
Mitsunori
Mitsunori,
Seki, yeah.
yeah, Mitsunori Seki. And so he finally becomes champion in 1968. He beats Mitsunori Seki, has a non-title fight, but then he fights Jose Legra, another long time, I mean, the dude had over 100 fights at this point, long time, very criminally underrated fighter, and gets stopped, and now his career ended. And it's like, he finally gets the success he wanted, and he loses the belt immediately almost. And he had beaten Legra before that, you know what I mean? But Legra was one of those guys that was just like a brilliant fighter from Cuba who had made it to the Miami Beach area. Credited with like influence in young Cassius Clay, among others. You know what I mean? Him and Willie Pastrano both helped out with that. And just a brilliant guy who struggled himself too with trying to get over the hump against like certain guys. You know what I mean? Like every time it was like, oh shit, and then something kind of funky would happen with him. Like for instance, Legra became champion, and then soon after, Saldivar came out of retirement and beat him over 10 rounds. And yeah, it was like topsy turvy for him.
Yeah, dude, it's that's a good one too, actually, because I probably wouldn't have thought to bring that up. But Winstone also, if I'm not mistaken, came from the same place in Wales that Johnny Owen came from.
Mhm.
So in any case, Yeah, dude, they both just kind of were, I guess, a little bit snake bitten, especially considering Saldívar was fairly dominant as a champion. Just a one more case of just coming around kind of at the wrong time, despite being a very, very good fighter.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you got to put them both up there with that, you know what I mean? Because Saldívar is just one of those guys that I said I consider him in the top 10 of Mexican fighters of all time. You know what I mean? That's a very deep list, but
He
like
gets underrated.
he gets very underrated. And it's also for the fact too, because one, what we said, the base of his career took place in the 60s. He made his comeback and a brilliant comeback too, which helps out his career, in fact, if anything, is that when he makes the comeback, his first fight is against Legra, like we said, which is incredible to think about. You're fighting him in the first fight after like 2 years or so, beats him by decision, beats Johnny Famichin for the featherweight title, loses it to Shibata, I believe, soon after that, but then gets knocked out um, gets knocked out by Eder Joffrey, and who was also making his comeback at that point too. And I think it was a fucking featherweight title fight, but still, it's like one of those. Okay, he loses his last two fights, but at that point, he was already kind of washed him through it. So who cares? You know what I mean? But the fact that his career ended in the early 70s, and then the fact also that he died, I say, really young. He died around like 1985 or so,
Mm,
of a heart
yeah.
attack, makes him completely forgotten. It's been over 40 years since he passed away. No one really talks about him like that. And the only time you really hear about him is when people are compiling, like historians are compiling like lists of like 20 greatest Mexican fighters or this and that. Then his name gets included in that.
Yeah, for me, similar, not necessarily in style per se, but similar in the sense that he probably does not get the respect that he deserves and probably doesn't get ranked on the all-time list of greatest Mexican fighters like he deserves, like Miguel Canto, who,
Yeah.
was came a little bit after him, but nonetheless was, also not your typical whatever style of fighters from Mexico that a lot of people think about, and was also, a really like tricky fighter, and not a very hard puncher, and so kind of gets underrated in that discussion, but a great fighter in his own right, but unfortunately didn't beat any British fighters, at least not prominent ones that I'm aware of, so can't figure in this discussion. But that being said, no, dude, that's a good one too, especially considering the series aspect of
Yeah,
it.
definitely. So I think we covered some good ground
I,
today.
I think we did too, and I think we kept it fair. Look, Brits. I'm not saying we are like massive in the UK or something. We have a huge British fan base, but I know that there are some. We're not trying to pick on you. We apologize. You guys kind of are on the bad snake bitten end of this right now, though. We'll see what happens with this whole Rodriguez Jr. business. I don't know, but at the very least, you don't got the momentum. So y'all need to work hard. Come on, get on this shit. Get in the gym. Work hard. You need to tip the scales back in your favor if that's what you want. Aris, I appreciate you. We did a little bit of homework for her. We have to look around somewhat to kind of entertain the masses. So I appreciate it, dude.
Definitely. There's always good subjects bringing up stuff, and especially bringing up fights that no one will really talk about. You know what I mean? So like
For
bringing up
sure.
rivalries that rarely get talked about, and we can relive them, and then our fans also get to listen to it is always a win-win. So
Yeah, it's not the same old shit. Hopefully
yeah,
that's also what we're providing as new stuff. Hopefully.
yeah. So I mean, on that end, enjoy the fights this weekend because we got stat cards tomorrow night and on Saturday. I'm working both of them shits, and should be good. So
Let's fucking go.
yep,
Everybody who listened in, thank you so much. We appreciate you. Go ahead and subscribe, leave a rating. That's great. You're on YouTube watching. Hey, what's up? Thank you. Subscribe, rating, comment, whatever, however that works. Social media, whatever. I don't know even what to say about that shit anymore. It's a fucking joke. But that being said, we are kind of on social media. So if you look around, there's the
you'll
little
find us.
things on the screen and all that stuff. But Eris, we'll talk soon, bro.
Have a good one.